Some mysteries begin with a whisper, others with a trace left where no trace should be. Good evening, my friend. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you to follow one such faint clue into the hidden corners of the wizarding world. Beyond the familiar halls and well-trodden paths lie forgotten marks, missing memories, and questions that refuse to remain buried. So settle in, listen closely, and let us step together into a mystery waiting patiently to be uncovered. The war had ended, and with it the long shadow of Lord Voldemort had finally been lifted from the wizarding world. Yet peace, as many quietly discovered, did not arrive all at once like a sunrise, but instead crept in slowly, uncertainly, as though it too feared what remnants of darkness might still linger in forgotten corners. Elias Crow stood beneath the high, enchanted ceiling of the Ministry of Magic, watching clouds drift lazily overhead, though he barely noticed their gentle motion, for his thoughts were fixed on something far less serene. The Auror office, rebuilt and restructured after the war, was now filled with a new generation. Witches and wizards who had grown up in the shadow of fear and now carried the responsibility of ensuring it would never return. Elias was among them, though unlike many, he had not fought at the Battle of Hogwarts. He had been too young then, a student still learning spells while others were risking everything. Now, however, he had earned his place, his robes marked with the subtle insignia of an Auror, his wand always within reach, his instincts sharpened by years of relentless training under veterans who spoke little of the war but taught everything it had forced them to learn. "Crow," came a voice, firm yet measured, pulling him from his thoughts. Elias turned to see Senior Auror Williamson approaching, a wizard whose reputation for precision was matched only by his refusal to tolerate mistakes. There was no wasted movement in him, no unnecessary words, and when he spoke, people listened. "You're being assigned your first independent case," Williamson said, handing over a thin file. "Nothing dramatic. Routine investigation. Illegal wand activity, likely leftovers from the war." Elias accepted the file, his fingers tightening slightly around its edges, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, anticipation mixed with the weight of expectation. "Yes, sir," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Don't let the word routine make you careless," Williamson added, his gaze sharp. "That's how problems grow." Elias nodded, already opening the file as Williamson walked away, leaving him alone once more beneath the shifting sky. Inside were reports, brief, factual, and yet quietly unsettling. Several instances of wand use had been detected in remote areas, magic that bore traces of spells associated with former Death Eaters. Yet the names attached to the locations did not match known fugitives or suspects. Instead, they belonged to ordinary witches and wizards, shopkeepers, healers, even a retired professor from a minor wizarding school. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The second was the pattern. Elias traced the locations on a map, his brow furrowing as he noticed how they formed a loose, almost deliberate arrangement, as though someone had planned it, though to what end he could not yet say. It would have been easy to dismiss it as coincidence, or perhaps as isolated incidents of lingering dark magic, but something in the precision of it all refused to sit comfortably in his mind. That evening, as the ministry corridors emptied and the usual hum of activity faded into a quiet murmur, Elias remained at his desk, reading through the reports again and again, searching for something he might have missed, something that would make sense of it all. At last, he closed the file and stood, slipping his wand into his sleeve with practiced ease. If there was one thing his training had taught him, it was that answers rarely revealed themselves on paper alone. The first location on the list was not far. A small village on the outskirts of Wizarding Britain, quiet and largely untouched by the chaos that had once consumed the country. By the time Elias arrived, night had settled, wrapping the village in a soft stillness broken only by the occasional flicker of light from cottage windows. There was nothing outwardly unusual, nothing that would suggest dark magic had ever been cast there, and yet the Ministry's detection spells did not lie. He walked slowly along the narrow path, his senses alert, his wand now in his hand, though held low, unobtrusive. The cottage he sought stood at the edge of the village, modest and well-kept, with a small garden that showed signs of careful tending. A warm light glowed from within, and for a moment Elias hesitated. This did not look like the home of someone dabbling in dangerous magic. Still, appearances, he reminded himself, could be deceiving. He stepped forward and knocked. There was a brief pause, followed by the sound of movement, and then the door opened to reveal a middle-aged witch, her expression one of mild curiosity rather than fear. "Yes?" she asked. Elias inclined his head slightly. "Elias Crow, Auror office. I'd like to ask you a few questions." The word Auror often carried weight, and he watched closely for any flicker of anxiety or guilt, but instead, the witch simply nodded and stepped aside. "Of course," she said, "though I'm afraid I don't know what this could be about." Inside, the cottage was warm and inviting, filled with the comforting scent of herbs and something faintly sweet. There was no sign of disturbance, no hint of anything unusual. Elias took a moment before speaking, choosing his words carefully. There was a report of magical activity here recently, unregistered spells, some of them concerning in nature. The witch frowned, genuinely puzzled. "I haven't done anything out of the ordinary, just simple household charms, nothing more." Elias studied her face, searching for any sign of deception, but found none. And yet the report had been clear. A silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken questions, until at last Elias spoke again, his voice quieter now. "Is there anything you remember? Anything unusual? Even something small?" The witch hesitated, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. She began, then stopped. Elias felt a subtle shift in the air, something intangible yet unmistakable, as though the moment itself had become fragile. "I suppose," she continued slowly, "there was one thing, but it doesn't make any sense." Elias leaned forward slightly. "Tell me." She met his gaze, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "There was a moment," she said, "just a few nights ago when I couldn't remember what I was doing. I was standing right here and then suddenly, I wasn't sure how I got there." Elias felt a chill run through him, though the room remained warm. Memory lapses were not unheard of, but combined with unregistered magic. Something was beginning to take shape, though its outline was still faint and incomplete. And for the first time since receiving the case, Elias Crow realized that this was not routine at all. In the years that followed the Battle of Hogwarts, when shattered towers had been restored, when scorched courtyards had been scrubbed clean by rain and careful hands, and when the names of the dead were spoken more softly than before, as though grief itself had learned to lower its voice, the wizarding world began the slow and uneasy labor of pretending that peace, once declared, would naturally settle over every home and hearth like winter snow upon an empty field. Yet peace was never so obedient, nor was fear so quick to surrender its place, for even after the banners of darkness had fallen, even after the last desperate screams of that terrible war had faded into memory, there remained in Britain 1,000 private wounds, 1,000 guarded silences, and 1,000 ordinary people who still woke in the night at the smallest creak of wood or whisper of wind, half believing that some masked figure had come at last to finish what the war had begun. Elias Crow belonged to that generation, which had been too young to shape the final battle, and yet old enough to be shaped by it. And if there was a bitterness in that condition, he carried it as one carries an old scar beneath a sleeve, neither displaying it nor denying that it was there. He had walked the corridors of Hogwarts during the years when caution had become instinct, when owls sometimes brought bad news wrapped in official parchment, and when professors who smiled at breakfast might wear the expression of soldiers by dusk. And though he had not stood among the defenders in the last stand against Voldemort, he had lived long enough under that darkening sky to understand what victory had cost, and how thin the wall between order and ruin could truly be. By the age of 26, he had earned a place in the Auror office, not through brilliance flashy enough to be remembered in gossip, nor through connections whispered over ministry dinners, but by a steadier quality that older Aurors valued more than they often admitted. For Elias possessed patience where others rushed, caution where others performed courage for its own sake, and a habit of noticing details so small that they seemed meaningless until the moment they did not. He was not the sort of man whose arrival changed the atmosphere of a room, nor the sort whose name drifted through the ministry canteen on the breath of rumor. Yet those who had trained beside him had learned that he rarely overlooked what mattered, and those who had tested him had discovered that he did not falter merely because a superior expected him to. On the morning the case found him, the Ministry of Magic wore its usual face of controlled urgency, which meant that memos zipped overhead like anxious birds. The lifts clanged and sighed as they rose through the great subterranean building, and witches and wizards in every shade of robe moved along the polished corridors with expressions suggesting that everything was under control, provided no one looked too closely. The enchanted ceiling above the atrium displayed a pale drift of cloud through a blue that belonged to no real weather over London. And Elias, standing for a moment near the edge of the Auror office with a roll of parchment in hand, found himself watching that false sky with a quiet distrust. He had always disliked the ministry ceiling for its cheerfulness, because it seemed to insist that order could be painted overhead even when disorder lived beneath it. Crow. The voice was clipped, dry, and impossible to mistake. Elias turned at once and saw Senior Auror Williamson approaching through the rows of desks, his black robes moving with that spare and deliberate efficiency which made even walking look like a professional judgment. Williamson had served before the war, through the war, and after it, which had left him with the expression of a man who no longer expected either competence or honesty from the world, but prepared daily to deal with both their absence and their counterfeits. He did not waste praise, did not soften criticism, and did not believe in the comfort of giving young Aurors easier truths than the ones they would eventually meet. "You're taking an independent inquiry," Williamson said, placing a slim ministry folder on Elias's desk without ceremony. "Low profile, wand misuse, irregular detection traces, probably leftovers, though I dislike that word." Elias rested one hand on the file, but did not open it immediately. "Any injuries?" "None reported." "Any suspects?" Williamson's mouth shifted, though not enough to resemble amusement. "That depends on whether you consider confused pensioners, a potioneer's widow, and a wizard who repairs self-stirring cauldrons to be likely dark operatives." Elias looked down then, opened the folder, and began scanning the contents while Williamson remained beside him. The reports were short, official, and therefore more revealing in what they omitted than in what they plainly stated. Unauthorized spell activity had been detected in several separate locations over the past 10 days, all of it strong enough to trigger ministry notice, and all of it carrying faint traces of spell families heavily associated with coercion, concealment, and directed force, though the exact incantations had not been witnessed firsthand. What stood out, however, was not merely the nature of the magic, but the names connected to each address, for none belonged to known sympathizers, black market traffickers, escaped prisoners, or even the usual petty dabblers in cursed objects. Instead, there appeared a herbologist in Wiltshire, a retired magical historian in Ottery St. Catchpole, a healer's assistant in Ludlow, and 2 others of similar harmlessness. "It doesn't fit," Elias murmured. "No," said Williamson, which in his case counted as agreement and warning at once. "That is why you've got it. Speak to them, verify what they know, and bring back something firmer than instinct. And Crow—" Elias looked up. "Do not treat confusion as innocence merely because it is less inconvenient that way." When Williamson moved on, Elias remained standing for a few moments with the folder open before him, reading the same lines twice, then a third time, while the noise of the office receded around him. There were 5 incidents, none close enough to be dismissed as one household's trouble spilling into the next. And yet when he copied the locations onto a fresh sheet of parchment and connected them with the tip of his quill, a shape almost emerged, not precise enough to call deliberate, but too suggestive to ignore. It resembled the beginning of a circle broken in 2 places, as though whoever had chosen the sites had either failed to complete a design or been interrupted before doing so. Routine, he thought, and almost smiled at the ministry's talent for using small words to cover large uncertainties. By late afternoon, he had gathered the supporting parchments, signed out for field inquiry, and taken the visitor route through the ministry, passing the security desk where a witch with silver half-moon spectacles checked his credentials without really seeing his face. Outside, London wore a damp gray light, and the air held the taste of recent rain on stone. Elias apparated first to the edge of a lane near the village named in the earliest report, then walked the remaining distance under a sky that had begun to fade toward evening. It was the sort of village Muggles would have described as peaceful, and perhaps it was, if peace could be measured by clipped hedges, lamplit windows, and the absence of visible disaster. Yet Elias had long since learned that the most troubling magic often occurred in places whose quiet seemed almost aggressively ordinary. The cottage he sought stood at the far end of a narrow road, lined with hawthorn, with a pale garden gate and a patch of earth where winter herbs had begun to push up in disciplined rows. There was warmth in the windows, and a kettle could be heard faintly singing from within. And everything about the house argued so strongly against menace that Elias felt his caution sharpen rather than ease. Houses that looked wrong were simple to approach. Houses that looked blameless demanded a more careful mind. He knocked, and after a few seconds the door opened to reveal a witch, perhaps in her late 40s, wearing a thick knitted cardigan over plum-colored robes, her fair hair pinned back carelessly, and her expression composed more of curiosity than alarm. "Yes?" she asked. "Elias Crow, Auror office," he said, drawing his identification just far enough to be seen. "I'm here regarding a report of unusual magical activity recorded at this address." The expected responses would have been indignation, defensiveness, or fear. But instead she frowned as though he had accused her kettle of smuggling contraband. "There must be some mistake," she said, though not with practiced innocence, for the words emerged from genuine puzzlement. "I haven't done anything unusual unless the ministry has outlawed trimming ivy." May I come in?" She hesitated only long enough to step aside. The front room was small, neat, and full of practical comforts, with shelves of dried herbs hanging from one beam, a tabby cat asleep in an armchair, and a polished table laid for one late supper. Nothing in the place suggested secret dealings, concealed visitors, or recent violence. Elias let his gaze pass over each detail without lingering long enough to insult her by obvious suspicion, then accepted the chair she indicated, while she remained standing beside the mantel, as if uncertain whether she ought to be embarrassed, annoyed, or merely inconvenienced. "My name is Clara Vane," she said. "I brew tinctures for St. Mungo's through an apothecary contact in Bath, though hardly anything dangerous. Sleeping infusions, digestive restoratives, one or two things for persistent coughs. If someone has said otherwise, they are a fool." The ministry traces detected strong wand activity here 3 nights ago, shortly after midnight, Elias replied. "Not domestic charm work, and not accidental discharge. I'm trying to establish whether someone else was present, whether your wand was taken, or whether there is any explanation you may have overlooked." She opened her mouth at once, ready to deny it, then stopped, and the change in her face was so slight that another man might have missed it. It wasn't guilt that passed through her expression, but something more troubling, because it looked like the first flicker of frightened recognition. "My wand was on the kitchen shelf," she said slowly. "I remember that because I had put out the candles and was preparing foxglove for drying. After that?" She looked toward the hearth, though there was nothing there to help her remember. "After that, I am not certain." Elias did not interrupt. Silence, he had learned, often invited truth more effectively than pressure. She folded one hand over the other. "I thought I had simply been tired, because I found myself standing near the back door with my wand in my hand, and could not at once recall why I had gone there. It was only a minute of confusion, perhaps less, and when nothing seemed wrong, I told myself not to be dramatic." "Had anything unusual happened earlier that day?" "No." "Any owl post, visitors, broken wards, strange dreams, headaches, lost time before this?" At the phrase "lost time," she looked at him fully, and for the first time there was real unease in her eyes. "Yes," she said, more quietly now. "A dream, perhaps 2 nights before. I had not thought it mattered. I was walking through fog, or what felt like fog, and someone ahead of me kept speaking, though I never saw a face. I woke with the sense that I had forgotten an instruction." The fire gave a soft crackle in the grate. Elias felt the room narrow around the words. "What instruction?" "I do not know." She pressed her fingertips lightly to her temple, ashamed of the uncertainty as sensible people often are. "That is what frightened me afterward, once I began thinking of it. It was not like forgetting where one leaves a teacup, nor like walking into a room and losing the reason. It felt as though something had been taken away cleanly, and only the shape of the missing piece remained." A colder line of thought opened in Elias's mind then, because this was no longer merely a question of suspicious spells cast in harmless homes. If Clara Vane spoke truly, then either someone had entered her house, controlled or modified her memory, and used her wand for purposes unknown, or else she herself had acted under a form of influence subtle enough to leave no full recollection and no obvious sign. Neither possibility belonged inside the word routine. "Miss Vane," he said, setting his voice carefully, "I'd like to examine your wand, if you permit it." She fetched it from the kitchen shelf and handed it over with the resigned care one gives to a stranger inspecting a family heirloom. Elias performed the initial diagnostic spells quickly and cleanly, and almost at once the wand gave back what he had half expected and wholly dreaded, because its recent magical residue bore evidence of forceful directional spellwork and concealment layering. Yet woven through both traces was something stranger, something filmy and difficult to pin down, as if another magical signature had brushed past the wood without ever fully settling into it. He lowered the wand very slowly. "What is it?" Clara asked. Elias did not answer at once, because he had not yet shaped the truth into words he trusted. He looked instead toward the small, dark pane of the back window, where his own reflection hovered over the night outside. And in that wavering glass he felt, with sudden certainty, that the case had already moved beyond isolated irregularities into something designed, deliberate, and far more intimate than open attack. Someone, somewhere, had found a way to turn ordinary witches and wizards into instruments without their knowing, and the first person to whom that truth had become visible was Elias Crow, standing in a warm cottage where nothing appeared broken except memory itself. When Elias Crow left Clara Vane's cottage, the night had deepened into that peculiar stillness which belongs only to villages sleeping under clouded skies, when even the wind seems reluctant to disturb the hedgerows, and every window glows like the guarded eye of some quiet and harmless creature. Yet the peace of the lane did nothing to settle his thoughts, because he carried with him not merely the memory of a frightened woman and a wand laced with suspicious residue, but the first solid proof that the case he had been given under the modest name of irregular wand activity concealed within it something far more dangerous than reckless spell work or the foolish experiments of amateurs. He did not apparate at once, for he wished first to think without the interruption of ministry walls and ministry voices, and so he walked beyond the last cottage, past a low field wall silvered by weak moonlight, until he reached an old ash tree standing alone beside the road. And there he drew Clara's wand once more from its wrapping and repeated the detection sequence with even greater care. The result did not change, though the second reading sharpened what the first had suggested, because beneath the clear marks of recent casting, there remained that same elusive interference, a magical trace unlike any ordinary spell residue he had seen in training or in practice, which did not cling to the wand in the clean pattern of a known incantation, but rather drifted through it like smoke through rafters, present enough to alter the reading and yet impossible to seize as a separate spell. That unsettled him more than a direct sign of dark magic would have done, because dark magic, however vile, belonged to a body of knowledge that could be catalogued, anticipated, and countered, whereas this felt instead like a method designed not merely to do harm, but to leave behind confusion rather than evidence. He wrapped the wand again, sealed the reading in a temporary evidence note, and at last disapparated with a crack into the narrow side corridor reserved for late returns to the ministry, where the torches burned lower and the stone passages magnified each footstep into a hollow reminder that some parts of the building never truly slept. The Auror office was almost empty when he entered, save for 2 night clerks bent over incoming reports and a junior Auror asleep at his desk with a quill still in hand, as though he had meant only to rest his eyes for a moment and had instead surrendered to exhaustion. Elias crossed to his own desk, lit the lamp, and began at once to compare Clara Vane's wand reading with the remaining case files. If there was a pattern, he needed to see it before the pattern learned to hide itself more carefully. By the time the clock mounted above the records cabinet chimed 1 in the morning, he had listed every common element between the reported incidents, and there were fewer than he had hoped, though each of them troubled him. In every case, the spell detection had occurred during late hours. In every case, the registered owner of the wand denied knowingly casting anything unusual. And in every case, there was either a brief lapse in memory or an account of disorientation so mild that a sensible person might have dismissed it as fatigue. One witness had mentioned waking with muddy shoes and no recollection of leaving the house. Another had recalled hearing what she thought was someone calling her name from another room, only to find herself later standing in the garden with her wand unclasped. On their own, such details would have sounded almost laughably fragile beside the brutal certainties the Auror office usually dealt in, yet taken together, they formed the outline of a mechanism, and Elias had been trained to distrust mechanisms he could not yet name. He was so deep in thought that he did not notice Williamson approach until the older Auror stopped beside the desk and cast his eye over the scattered parchments. "You are either diligent," Williamson said in that dry voice of his, "or you have found trouble large enough to justify ignoring the hour." Elias rose slightly from his chair out of instinctive respect, then thought better of it, and remained where he was. "I went to the first address." "And?" "She appears innocent." Williamson's eyebrow shifted by the smallest degree. "You say that too quickly." "She appears innocent," Elias repeated, "and her wand does not." That was enough to hold the older man in place. Elias explained everything without embroidery, from Clara's missing memory to the residual traces on the wand, and while Williamson gave no outward sign of alarm, his attention sharpened in the way a blade catches light. "Mind interference?" Williamson asked when Elias had finished. "Possibly, though it does not resemble standard memory charm residue, and I do not think Imperius fits either, not if the victim remains mobile, functional, and afterward senses only a whole rather than compulsion." Williamson rested one hand on the edge of the desk. "There are older methods, rare, obscure, and mostly abandoned because they are unreliable." "By whom?" "By sensible criminals," Williamson said. "Which means our suspect may not be sensible, or may be sufficiently skilled to make an unreliable method dependable." He reached for Clara's wand reading, studied it in silence, then laid it down. "You will continue the interviews. Quietly. Speak to the remaining 4 before word spreads that the ministry is sniffing around harmless households for ghosts. And crow." Elias looked up. "Trust the frightened more than the calm. When people lie, they prepare their faces. When they truly do not understand what has happened to them, confusion leaks through before pride can contain it." With that, he departed, leaving Elias once more to his lamp and papers, though now the case had shifted in one important respect, because suspicion in the eyes of a senior Auror gave even a fragile theory more weight than instinct alone. Elias worked another hour, then gathered what he needed, and went not to his flat, but to the secure evidence room, where he placed Clara Vane's wand in temporary storage and signed the log with careful precision. Only after that did he leave the ministry, and even then sleep did not come easily, because when he closed his eyes, he found himself imagining an invisible will sliding through quiet homes, borrowing the hands of strangers, leaving behind only unease and the faint outline of missing time. He rose before dawn and returned to the field by 8 o'clock, first traveling to Ludlow, where the second name on his list lived above a narrow shop that repaired magical instruments, too delicate or too outdated for commercial service. The wizard who answered the door was called Bernard Pike, a thin and stooped man whose spectacles enlarged his eyes until they seemed perpetually surprised by the world. He smelled faintly of brass polish and star charts, and when Elias introduced himself, Pike's first response was not fear, but embarrassment, as though an Auror's presence might reflect badly upon his housekeeping. "I have paid my licensing fees," he said at once, leading Elias upstairs into rooms crowded with ticking devices, folded maps, and boxed telescopic lenses. "If this is about the imported calibrator rods, I can produce the paperwork. though the supplier in Prague writes as if punctuation were illegal. "It is not about licensing," Elias said. "It concerns wand activity recorded here 2 nights ago." Pike went very still then, and after a long breath, he sat down heavily beside a work table strewn with silver screws, no larger than grains of rice. "So it was real," he murmured. "What was?" The older wizard rubbed both palms against his knees. "I thought I had dreamed it, because one sounds foolish saying such things aloud. I was working late, which I often do because the little clockwork moons on a celestial alignment sphere had seized again, and I remember hearing the shop bell ring downstairs. That was strange already, because I had locked the door. I took my wand and went to see who had entered, but when I reached the landing, I was no longer walking toward the shop. I was in the alley behind the building, standing in the rain with my wand out, staring at the back wall as if I had been expecting it to speak." "Were you alone?" "I believe so, though for a moment I had the strongest impression that someone was just beyond my sight, not hidden exactly, but withheld." Those last words lodged themselves in Elias's mind with immediate force. "Withheld?" Pike nodded uneasily. "Do not ask me what I mean, because I could not explain it properly, yet that is how it felt. Not invisible in the ordinary sense, and not gone either, but present in a way my eyes could not complete." Elias asked every formal question after that, about visitors, recent purchases, acquaintances from the war years, strange post, broken wards, headaches, dreams, and unexplained objects, and the answers produced nothing substantial until he came to the subject of sound. "Did you hear anything besides the bell?" Pike hesitated. "A phrase, perhaps, though I cannot swear it. It was as if someone had begun giving me instructions from the next room, but the words were already fading before I understood them. I caught only the end." "What end?" The wizard's face tightened with the effort of remembering. "Not words one expects to hear, certainly not in one's own shop. It was something like, 'Complete the 5th. Elias did not move for a moment. "Are you certain?" "No," Pike said miserably. "I am certain only that it was close to that." When Elias asked to inspect the wand, Bernard Pike surrendered it at once, and the residue proved consistent with Clara Vane's case, though this time the hidden interference was stronger, enough that Elias felt a chill of recognition even before the diagnostic charm fully settled. The same filmy intrusion, the same sense that another magic had crossed the wand without truly belonging to it. And now, at last, the first fragment of intention had emerged from the fog, because "complete the 5th" was not the sort of phrase an afflicted mind would invent without cause. It implied sequence, design, and purpose. It implied that the scattered incidents were not merely tests or accidents, but parts of a work being built piece by piece through unwilling hands. He left the shop with the second wand secured under ministry authority, and his thoughts moving faster than caution liked. 5 incidents, 5 locations, a broken circle on the map. Complete the 5th. He found a public owl post 2 streets away and sent Williamson a concise note requesting immediate review of the case pattern, then turned down the lane to apparate, only to stop before he reached the alley's end. There, on the damp brick wall opposite him, where no report had mentioned any mark and where Pike had sworn he had found nothing unusual, a faint line shimmered for one instant in the corner of Elias's eye. He turned sharply, wand already raised, and spoke the revealing charm before the thought had fully formed. Silver light spread across the wall in a thin, rippling veil, and as it did so, something hidden beneath ordinary sight awakened. Not a word, not yet a shape, but the beginning of a curved symbol no wider than a handspan, dark and gleaming like old ink under moonlight, as though some unseen draftsman had laid the first stroke of a larger design and trusted that no one but the right victim would ever think to look closely enough to find it. For a long and breathless moment, Elias Crow remained standing before the damp brick wall, his wand still raised, his gaze fixed upon the faint, unnatural curve that had revealed itself beneath the soft wash of the revealing charm, because what lay before him was not merely a hidden marking, nor even the careless residue of magic, but something far more deliberate, far more precise, and far more unsettling than anything he had yet encountered in this investigation. The symbol, if it could be called such in its incomplete state, did not shimmer or flicker, as most concealed enchantments did when forced into visibility, but instead held its form with a quiet and stubborn clarity, as though it existed half outside the reach of ordinary spells, neither entirely present nor entirely absent, and for that very reason it seemed to resist not only concealment, but understanding itself. Elias stepped closer, his boots making no sound upon the damp stones, and lowered his wand slightly, not out of carelessness, but out of instinct. For there are moments in an Auror's life when force is not the answer, when the proper response to an unknown magic is not to strike or dispel, but to observe with patience, sharp enough to cut through deception. He extended his hand, hesitating only briefly before allowing his fingers to hover just short of the wall, because something deep within him, something older than training and more stubborn than reason, warned him against direct contact, as though the mark itself possessed a will that would notice such intrusion and answer it in ways he could not yet predict. The air around the symbol felt wrong. Not cold, not warm, but somehow thinner, as though the space itself had been stretched ever so slightly, creating a subtle tension that made the skin along his arm prickle in quiet protest. And as he stood there, studying the curve, he realized with a slow and growing certainty that this was not the work of a single spell cast in isolation, but rather the fragment of something larger, something that extended beyond this wall, beyond this alley, perhaps even beyond the scattered locations he had marked upon his map. "Complete the fifth," he murmured under his breath, recalling Bernard Pike's uneasy words, and as he spoke them aloud, the symbol seemed to shift, not visibly, not in any way that could be proven, but in that subtle and disquieting manner that certain forms of magic possess, where recognition itself becomes a kind of interaction. Elias withdrew his hand at once. There was danger here, not the obvious and immediate kind that could be countered with a shield charm or broken with a well-placed curse, but something quieter, something that operated beneath awareness, that waited not for resistance, but for attention. And he understood then that whoever, or whatever, had created this pattern did not require the cooperation of its victims in the ordinary sense, but instead relied upon something far more insidious: proximity, observation, and perhaps even curiosity itself. He straightened slowly, drawing in a measured breath, and with careful precision he cast a series of containment spells around the section of wall, weaving them one over the other until the air shimmered faintly with layered protection, not because he believed the symbol would attempt to escape, but because he had no intention of allowing anyone else to stumble upon it unprepared. Only then did he step back and lower his wand completely. The alley seemed unchanged, the bricks ordinary once more to the untrained eye, the faint drip of water from a nearby gutter continuing as though nothing at all had disturbed the quiet rhythm of the morning. And yet Elias knew with absolute certainty that something had shifted, not in the world around him, but in the nature of the case itself. This was no longer an investigation into isolated incidents. This was the beginning of something structured, something deliberate, something unfinished. He turned without another glance at the wall and walked swiftly toward the apparition point, his mind already moving ahead, assembling fragments into patterns, questions into possibilities, because the phrase would not leave him, nor would the shape of the symbol, nor the undeniable implication that whatever design lay hidden across these locations was being built piece by piece through the unwitting actions of those who believed themselves to be living ordinary lives. By the time he returned to the ministry, the corridors had filled once more with the steady movement of witches and wizards attending to their duties, yet Elias moved through them with a focus that set him apart, for he carried with him knowledge that did not yet belong to the rest of the building, and such knowledge, he had learned, created its own kind of isolation. Williamson was already waiting. He stood near Elias's desk, the message from the owl post in his hand, his expression as controlled as ever, though there was now a tension beneath it that had not been present before. "You found something," he said. "Yes," Elias replied, placing his notes and the secured wand upon the desk. "A hidden marking at the second location, not visible without a revealing charm, not ordinary concealment. It appears to be part of a larger construct." Williamson's gaze sharpened. "Describe it." Elias did so in detail, omitting nothing, including the sensation of distortion in the air and the subtle reaction when he spoke the phrase aloud. And when he finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that follows the introduction of a problem too complex to be dismissed and too dangerous to be ignored. "At the first location," Williamson said slowly, "did you find anything similar?" "No," Elias replied, though even as he spoke, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. "But I did not know to look for it." Williamson nodded once. "Then you will return, quietly. Confirm whether the pattern exists there as well." "And the phrase?" Elias asked. Williamson's expression hardened, though not with anger, but with the weight of recognition. If someone is constructing something in stages, using 5 points, then whatever it is, it will not remain incomplete for long. Elias felt the truth of that settle heavily within him. "How many incidents were reported?" 5, Williamson said. The word seemed to echo, not in the room, but in Elias's thoughts, aligning itself with the phrase, with the symbol, with the map he had drawn only hours before, and for the first time since the case had begun, the full shape of the conflict revealed itself with undeniable clarity. Someone was using innocent witches and wizards as instruments. Someone was guiding them, controlling them, erasing their awareness. And someone was very close to finishing whatever they had begun. Elias closed the file slowly, his fingers tightening just enough to betray the resolve forming beneath his calm exterior. Then there was no time left for hesitation. Because if the 5th point had already been completed, then the design was no longer being built. It was waiting. Elias Crow did not waste another moment in the Auror office, because there are hours in certain investigations when reflection becomes a form of delay, and delay itself begins to favor the hand of the unseen adversary. And he knew, with the cold and steady certainty that had carried him through every hard lesson of his training, that the case had entered such an hour. The scattered irregularities were no longer scattered, the memory lapses were no longer harmless, and the hidden mark upon Bernard Pike's wall had transformed suspicion into structure, which meant that every remaining uncertainty had become more dangerous than ignorance, because someone had already taken 5 ordinary lives in hand and bent them, however briefly, toward a single concealed purpose. Before leaving, He returned to his desk long enough to spread out the map once more beneath the glow of his lamp. And this time, instead of merely connecting the reported sites in the order they had appeared in the file, he marked them according to time. The result tightened something in his chest at once, for the sequence did not wander at random across Wizarding Britain, but moved with intention, beginning in the south, curving northwest, then east, then back toward the center. As though each point had been chosen not only for position, but for relationship. And when he sketched the incomplete figure that emerged from the pattern, he saw that it resembled neither rune nor ward in any ministry guide he knew, but something older in spirit, a binding geometry rather than a written sign, the sort of design that sought not merely to mark a place, but to connect places until distance itself behaved differently. He folded the map, tucked it into the inner pocket of his robes, collected the evidence copies he would need, and left again through the side exit, passing beneath the ministry's false sky without so much as a glance upward, because the cheerful drift of enchanted clouds would only have offended him now. Outside, London wore the washed brightness that sometimes follows rain, yet the freshness in the air did nothing to lighten the burden of what he carried in his thoughts. And when he apparated back to Clara Vane's lane, arriving this time not with the measured calm of a first inquiry but with sharper purpose, he found the village exactly as before, quiet, modest, and unwilling to admit that anything sinister could have taken root within it. Clara answered his second knock more quickly than the first, and the sight of him standing on her doorstep again brought instant worry to her face, though she tried to conceal it behind courtesy. "Has something happened?" she asked, drawing her cardigan tighter around her shoulders as though the question itself had chilled her. "Yes," Elias said, because honesty, judiciously given, often secured more cooperation than vagueness ever could. "I need to examine the exterior of your property, especially the back of the cottage and any walls or stones near where you found yourself that night." She stepped aside at once, not even pretending to understand, and led him through the narrow kitchen to the rear garden, where the earth still held the dark softness of recent rain, and the herbs along the path breathed out their bitter green fragrance as he passed. The back wall of the cottage faced a small enclosed yard, bordered on one side by an old stone boundary, half overtaken by ivy, and it was there, before he had even fully reached it, that his instincts tightened. Not because he could see anything yet, but because the air once again possessed that faintly thinned quality, as though invisible threads had been drawn through it and pulled just enough to leave a tension perceptible only to someone already alert for it. Elias raised his wand and cast the same revealing charm he had used in Ludlow, letting the silver light move in a broad and patient wash across the stones, the door frame, the rain barrel, and the creeping ivy. And for one breathless instant, nothing happened. Then, as the light touched the lower stretch of the boundary wall, a dark curve awakened beneath the lichen, not painted on the stone, but existing somehow within it, sleek and gleaming as wet ink, matching the mark he had found behind Bernard Pike's shop so precisely that doubt itself seemed childish. Clara let out a small sound behind him, not quite a gasp and not yet a cry, but the involuntary voice of a person confronted with proof that her unease had not been imagination after all. "You did not see this before?" Elias asked without turning. "No," she whispered. "I swear I did not." "I believe you." He approached the wall carefully, keeping enough distance to avoid direct contact, and studied the mark in silence. This one curved the opposite way from Pike's, and when he traced both positions in memory, he understood that they were not duplicates, but complementary strokes, two fragments of a larger whole distributed across separate places, like pieces of a broken seal. The realization brought with it a fresh and more troubling thought. because if each victim had been used to place or awaken one part of the design, then the fifth incident might have completed not merely a pattern, but an opening of some kind, a circuit waiting only for activation. "Miss Vane," he said quietly, still watching the symbol, "when you lost time that night, did you feel drawn anywhere in particular, even for a moment, even if it made no sense?" She was silent long enough that he thought she might not answer, and when she finally did, her voice carried the hesitance of someone ashamed to speak what sounds foolish. "To the earth," she said. "That is the closest I can say it. I remember standing here afterward and having the strange feeling that I had been listening, not with my ears but with my hands, as though the stones wanted something from me, and I had understood them for a moment, only I could not remember what." Elias closed his eyes briefly, because that description was too strange to be invented by ordinary anxiety and too specific to ignore. Listening through the hands, stones wanting something, a design laid through walls, alleys, and homes. This was not random coercion for private mischief or petty gain. This was construction by sympathetic channels, magic working through physical anchors. He laid containment wards over the mark, just as he had done in Ludlow, then asked Clara for permission to examine the yard for traces. The search yielded little at first, beyond ordinary residues of domestic enchantment, but near the base of the wall, partly hidden beneath a cluster of rosemary, he detected a faint smear of displaced soil and knelt to inspect it more closely. Buried scarcely deeper than a finger's length beneath the earth lay a splinter of blackened material, no larger than a thumbnail, smooth on one side and rough on the other, as though it had broken from something older and harder than stone. He levitated it at once into an evidence file rather than touch it, and even through the glass he disliked the look of it, because it drank in light without gleam, possessing that deadened darkness found in certain cursed relics and in wood long exposed to destructive magic. "What is it?" Clara asked from behind him. "I do not know yet," Elias replied, which was true and not reassuring. He returned to the ministry with the new evidence and found Williamson in a secure consultation room rather than the main office, which told Elias before a word was spoken that the case had already been elevated beyond its earlier status. On the table before the senior Auror lay copies of all 5 reports, a rune index, 3 reference volumes on obscure magical structures, and a basin of cooling tea gone untouched. "You were right," Elias said, placing the file and his fresh notes on the table. "There is a second mark at Clara Vane's property. Same hidden condition, different stroke. These fragments belong together." Williamson picked up the file, turning it slowly between finger and thumb, while remaining careful not to break the seal. "Where did you find this?" "At the base of the wall. Buried recently, I think." The older Auror's eyes narrowed with something very like dislike. "It may be burned to you." Elias looked up at once. "Wandwood?" "Possibly, though not from an ordinary broken wand. Burnt yew exposed to certain preserving curses can hold magical intention long after use, especially in anchoring work, though I have not seen it employed this way." Williamson set the file down. "Yew has an unfortunate history, as you know." Elias knew it well enough. Yew carried associations the wizarding world never fully forgot. Not because the wood was evil in itself, for no wood was, but because certain wands and certain histories had made it a thing people mentioned carefully. "What kind of structure uses physical anchors in separate locations?" he asked. Williamson opened one of the reference books and turned it toward him. Upon the page was an illustration of an archaic magical figure composed of multiple distant points connected through repeated acts of channeling. The notes beneath were spare and grim. "Distributed lattice enchantments," Williamson said. "Rare, complicated, and largely theoretical in modern Britain because they require either willing participants at each point or imposed action through linked minds. Most were designed either to ward large territories, distort passage, or conceal a central site by confusing approaches to it." "A central site," Elias repeated. "Yes," said Williamson, "which means that if 5 points have been established, the only question remaining is what lies at the center." For a moment neither man spoke, because the answer hanging between them was dangerous enough without being voiced too quickly. Then Elias drew out his map, unfolded it on the table, and placed weights on the corners. He marked the 2 confirmed symbols, then the remaining 3 incident sites, then drew new lines according to the geometry Williamson's book suggested, rather than the simpler sequence he had first sketched. The result emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, and when it did, both men saw at once that the crossing lines did not meet in a town or known ministry property, but in an isolated stretch of countryside west of Oxfordshire, near an abandoned estate long ago removed from ordinary magical maps after a fire, and subsequent legal dispute had left it uninhabited. Williamson's face altered very little, yet Elias could sense the significance before the older Auror spoke. "Blackthorn Hall," he said. The name meant nothing to Elias at first, which was in itself alarming, because Williamson was not a man to name an empty ruin with that tone, unless the place had history. "What is Blackthorn Hall?" "A house," Williamson replied, "or what remains of one. It belonged before the war to Septimus Vale, an unspeakable briefly investigated for unauthorized experiments involving memory transference and intent imprinting. No charges held. His records vanished in the chaos during the ministry takeover under Thicknessa, and Vale himself died 2 years after the war under circumstances polite people described as secluded." Elias stared at the map. "And now someone may be using a lattice to conceal the estate." "Or to awaken something there," Williamson said. The room seemed smaller after that, the air heavier, as though knowledge itself had thickened. 5 ordinary people manipulated into placing or empowering hidden marks, fragments of burnt yew buried at anchor points, a dead unspeakable's estate at the center. Whatever conflict had begun in stolen minutes and harmless homes was no longer merely about clearing the names of frightened citizens. It had become a race toward a concealed place built, perhaps years ago, for magic the post-war ministry had failed to bury as completely as it had believed. Williamson straightened and closed the reference book with a soft, final thud. "You will not go alone," he said. Elias almost answered too quickly, because urgency had already begun to move through him like a drawn string, but he mastered the impulse. "Who are you assigning?" Williamson's expression became unreadable. "For now, no one, because if the lattice is still active, a larger team may trigger it. We need confirmation before force." He paused, then added with careful weight, "You and I will go tonight." And as Elias looked again at the crossing lines on the map and at the dark little splinter resting within its glass vial, he understood that the shape hidden beneath the case had finally shown its true direction, leading not outward into wider confusion, but inward toward a buried center waiting in silence for those clever or unfortunate enough to find it. They departed the ministry only after dusk had fully claimed the sky, not because darkness offered comfort, but because it provided concealment of a different kind, one that reduced the chance of their movement being noticed by any watching presence that might already be tied to the lattice Elias had uncovered. And as they stepped beyond the boundaries of London and into the colder, more open countryside westward, the world seemed to thin around them, shedding the reassuring noise of civilization until only the quiet remained, deep and watchful, as though the land itself had become aware of what approached. Williamson apparated first, choosing a point a considerable distance from their destination, because neither of them intended to risk crossing whatever unseen perimeter might already be established around Blackthorn Hall. And when Elias followed, the sensation of arrival struck him with unusual force, not because of the physical displacement, which he had mastered long ago, but because of the immediate and undeniable shift in the air itself, for even before he could properly orient himself beneath the dark outline of distant trees, he felt the same faint tension he had noticed at the marked sites. Only here it was stronger, layered, and far more deliberate, like threads drawn tight across a wide and silent loom. They stood upon a narrow rise overlooking a stretch of neglected land where the remnants of an old boundary wall traced a broken perimeter, and beyond that, barely visible through the tangle of overgrown hedges and skeletal branches, lay the shadow of the house itself, a shape too large to be mistaken for anything natural and too still to be mistaken for anything inhabited. Yet Elias did not need to see its details to know that this was their destination, because the lattice he had mapped seemed to converge in his mind with an almost physical pull, aligning thought and instinct toward the same point. "No light," he murmured. "Not a reassuring sign," Williamson replied, his voice low, his wand already drawn, but held in a manner that suggested readiness rather than aggression. They moved forward together, not with haste, but with careful precision, stepping where the ground allowed and pausing often enough to test the air for resistance, because both knew that whatever had been constructed here was unlikely to announce itself openly, and would instead lie in wait for the careless or the overconfident. The path that had once led to the estate was nearly lost beneath grass and creeping ivy, yet traces of its original shape remained, guiding them in a slow curve toward the main approach. And as they advanced, Elias began to notice something that tightened his focus further. The silence was too complete. There were no night insects, no distant calls of owls, no rustle of small creatures moving through the undergrowth, and though such absence might have gone unnoticed under ordinary circumstances, here it felt unnatural, as though the land had been instructed, gently but firmly, to remain still. They reached the boundary wall and halted. Up close, the stones revealed themselves to be older than Elias had first assumed, weathered not only by time, but by magic, bearing faint and eroded markings that suggested earlier enchantments long since faded or overwritten. And as he traced them with his eyes, he realized that this place had not been chosen at random by the one who now used it, but had likely been selected for what it already was, a site layered with past workings, a foundation upon which something new could be built with greater ease. "Do you feel it?" he asked quietly. Williamson did not answer at once, but after a moment he inclined his head slightly. "Yes, the lattice is active." Elias closed his eyes briefly, focusing not on sight, but on sensation, allowing his awareness to extend outward in the manner he had been taught only in the later stages of his training, when the distinction between spell and environment became something more fluid. The tension in the air was no longer subtle here, but structured, forming invisible lines that intersected and overlapped, creating a web that did not block passage outright, but altered it, as though each step taken within its reach was being observed, measured, perhaps even recorded. "It is not a barrier," he said after a moment, "more like a guide or a filter." Williamson's gaze remained fixed ahead. "Which means it may allow us through, provided we do not disrupt it." Or it may allow us through because it expects us, Elias replied. That possibility lingered between them, unspoken yet fully understood, and after a brief pause, Williamson gestured forward. We proceed. Carefully. No unnecessary spells. They crossed the boundary. The moment Elias stepped beyond the broken wall, the sensation changed. It was not a jolt, not a visible shift, but a subtle realignment, as though the world had tilted by the smallest possible degree, enough to unsettle balance without revealing the cause. And for a fraction of a second, he felt the faintest echo of something brushing against his thoughts. Not an intrusion, not yet, but a recognition, as though the lattice itself had taken note of his presence. He did not react outwardly. Instead, he continued forward, matching Williamson's pace, his focus divided between the physical path ahead and the unseen structure that surrounded them. Because if this construct was indeed designed to respond to those within it, then awareness would be both their greatest advantage and their greatest vulnerability. The house loomed closer with each step. Blackthorn Hall had once been grand. That much was clear even in its current state, for its proportions spoke of wealth and ambition. Yet time and neglect had reduced it to something hollow and uncertain. Its windows dark, its roofline broken in places, and its entrance half swallowed by climbing vines that had claimed the stone as their own. And yet, despite its ruin, there was something undeniably present within it, something that resisted the idea of abandonment, as though the house had never truly been left behind, but merely waited. They reached the threshold and stopped. The door, once heavy and imposing, now hung slightly ajar, its surface marked by long faded symbols that Elias could not immediately identify, though he suspected they had once served as wards or declarations of ownership. And as he studied them, he felt again that faint pressure at the edge of his mind, stronger now, more defined, like a distant voice attempting to form words just beyond hearing. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Williamson's jaw tightened. "Not with my ears." Elias nodded. The phrase came to him then, not as a sound, but as a thought that did not entirely belong to him, slipping into place with unsettling familiarity. Complete the fifth. His grip on his wand tightened instinctively, though he forced himself not to move, not to react in any visible way, because to acknowledge the influence too openly might invite it to deepen, and instead he focused on grounding himself, recalling the training that had taught him to distinguish between his own thoughts and those imposed from without. "This is where it leads," he said quietly. "Whatever the lattice is meant to do, it is centered here." Williamson gave a single decisive nod. "Then we end it here." Without another word, he pushed the door open. The interior of Blackthorn Hall greeted them not with immediate danger, but with a stillness so profound that it felt almost deliberate, as though the house itself had drawn a breath and held it in anticipation of their arrival. And as Elias stepped across the threshold, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever had begun in quiet villages and forgotten alleys had reached its culmination here, within these silent walls, and that the conflict he had uncovered was no longer hidden. It was waiting. The moment Elias Crow crossed the threshold of Blackthorn Hall, he felt the world behind him close with a quiet and irrevocable finality, as though the act of entering had not merely carried him into an abandoned house, but into a space deliberately set apart from the rest of reality, where ordinary rules no longer held complete authority, and where intention, once formed, might carry far greater weight than any spoken spell. The air inside was neither stale nor fresh, but preserved, as though the passage of time itself had been slowed or redirected, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but occupied, filled with the faintest echo of something that had once been active and had never entirely ceased to be so. The entrance hall stretched before them, its high ceiling lost in shadow, its floor of black stone cracked but not collapsed, and its walls lined with remnants of old enchantments that flickered faintly when touched by the light of their wands. Like memories struggling to hold their shape. Williamson stepped forward first, his movements measured, his attention divided between the visible and the unseen, and Elias followed half a pace behind, allowing his senses to expand in careful increments, because here, more than anywhere else in the case, he understood that perception itself was not entirely trustworthy, and that what he saw might be only a fragment of what truly existed within these walls. "There," Williamson said quietly, gesturing toward the far end of the hall. Elias turned his gaze and felt his breath tighten. Upon the stone floor, etched not with crude force but with precise and deliberate intent, lay a pattern that matched the fragments he had uncovered in the field. Though here it was no longer incomplete, no longer hidden, but fully realized. Its lines forming a complex geometric structure that seemed to draw the eye inward, toward a central point where the stone had darkened to a depth that absorbed even the light of their wands. The lattice had been completed. Not merely assembled, but activated. Elias stepped closer, compelled not by recklessness, but by the need to understand. And as he did, the faint pressure at the edge of his mind intensified, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but present, forming shapes that hovered just beyond clarity, like words waiting to be spoken by a voice that had not yet decided whether to reveal itself. "Do not engage it directly," Williamson warned, though his own gaze remained fixed upon the center of the pattern. "We do not know its full function." Elias nodded, though he could not entirely suppress the pull he felt toward the design, because it was not merely a construct of magic, but a structure of intention, built through the unwitting actions of 5 individuals whose minds had been touched, guided, and altered just enough to serve a purpose they could not remember. 5 points, Elias murmured. 5 anchors. And this is the convergence. Williamson crouched slightly, studying the lines without crossing them. A distributed lattice, fully closed, which means whatever it was meant to contain, conceal, or access is now active. The word active seemed to echo through the hall, not as sound, but as awareness, and for a moment Elias felt something shift, not in the pattern, not in the house, but within himself, as though the lattice had acknowledged his understanding and responded to it in kind. Then the voice came. Not through the air, not through the ears, but directly into the mind, smooth and controlled, carrying neither urgency nor threat, but something far more unsettling. Calm certainty. "You see it," the voice said. Elias froze, though he did not allow his body to betray the reaction, and instead focused on maintaining the boundaries of his own thoughts, because he knew at once that this was no residual echo, no fading trace of magic, but an active presence, aware of them, aware of him. Williamson's hand tightened around his wand, though he did not speak, which told Elias that he, too, had heard it. "You understand the structure," the voice continued, its tone almost approving. "That places you ahead of most." Elias drew a slow breath, steadying himself, and answered not aloud, but with deliberate thought, projecting the response in the same manner in which it had been delivered, because he understood instinctively that to remain silent would not shield him, and might instead invite deeper intrusion. Who are you?" There was a pause, not empty, but measured, as though the question had been anticipated and weighed before any answer was given. "A custodian," the voice replied at last, "of work left unfinished." Elias felt a flicker of cold realization. Septimus Vale. Not a ghost, not in the traditional sense, but something preserved, something anchored, perhaps through the very lattice that now surrounded them. "You are using them," Elias said, his thoughts sharp, controlled. "Innocent people. You took their minds and turned them into tools." "They were not taken," the voice replied calmly. "They were guided. A minor adjustment, a necessary correction. Their lives remain intact, their memories only incomplete." Elias's jaw tightened, though his expression did not change. "You erased their will." "I refined it," the voice said, and now, for the first time, there was the faintest trace of something beneath the calm. Not anger, not defensiveness, but conviction. "The mind is a structure, Auror, not a sacred relic. It can be shaped, improved, directed toward greater purpose. What I have done is no more invasive than the spells your ministry employs daily, only more precise." Williamson stepped forward then, his voice cutting through the mental exchange with deliberate force. "Show yourself." The air shifted. At the center of the lattice, where the darkness had seemed to absorb light itself, something began to form, not solid at first, but gathering, condensing, until a figure emerged, tall, thin, its features indistinct, yet unmistakably human, its presence anchored not in flesh, but in the pattern beneath it. Septimus Vale, or what remained of him. His face, if it could be called that, carried no expression in the ordinary sense, yet there was an intelligence within it, a clarity that suggested not decay, but preservation, as though the man had not died so much as transferred himself into a state beyond physical limitation. "You have come sooner than I expected," Vale said, now speaking both aloud and within their minds, his voice echoing softly through the hall. "That is encouraging." Elias did not move. "End it." Vale tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might once have been human curiosity. "And what?" "This," Elias replied, gesturing toward the lattice. "Release them. Dismantle whatever you have built." Vale's form seemed to ripple, not with instability, but with something closer to contemplation. "You misunderstand," he said. "This is not a weapon. It is a gateway, a means of extending awareness beyond the limitations of the individual mind. What you see here is only the first iteration, a proof of concept." Elias felt the weight of those words settle into place. "You are building a network," he said slowly, "a system that connects minds." "Yes," Vale replied, and now there was no concealment, no hesitation. A unified structure, no isolation, no ignorance, no fragmentation. "The wizarding world has suffered too long from the limitations of individual thought. I intend to remove those limitations." Williamson's voice was cold. "By stripping people of their autonomy." "By elevating them beyond it," Vale corrected. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the moment before decision. Elias tightened his grip on his wand, his mind already moving ahead, already calculating, because the conflict had reached its center, and there would be no retreat from it now. Not for him. Not for anyone. For several long heartbeats after Septimus Vale's final words had fallen into the stillness of Blackthorn Hall, neither Elias Crow nor Senior Auror Williamson moved, because there are moments in the life of any witch or wizard, and perhaps even more so in the life of an Auror, when action taken too swiftly becomes a gift to the enemy, and both men understood, with the seasoned instinct of those who had spent years studying danger in all its forms, that the thing standing before them was not merely a clever, dark wizard clinging to life by grotesque means, but a mind that had already traded ordinary human limits for something colder, more methodical, and far more difficult to predict. Vale's form hovered above the converging lines of the lattice with an ease that was almost offensive in its composure, neither ghostly in the mournful fashion of spirits bound by regret, nor bodily in the way a living wizard occupies space, but instead existing in that unnerving state between substance and idea, as though the house, the pattern beneath him, and his own consciousness had become parts of a single functioning mechanism. His features remained slightly indistinct, never blurring enough to disappear, and yet never settling into full fleshly clarity. And it occurred to Elias with a rising sense of disgust that this was no accident of magic, but design, because a man who had devoted himself to the shaping of minds would not have accepted death as an interruption, but only as a technical obstacle to be solved. A proof of concept, Williamson repeated at last, his voice clipped with contempt. You enslave 5 innocent people, alter their memories, use their wands and homes as anchors for a concealed lattice, and you expect us to believe you call that a scholarly inconvenience rather than a criminal act. Vale regarded him without visible irritation, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. Criminality is a word for systems protecting their own habits, he said. Innovation is almost always condemned before it becomes useful. Williamson raised his wand a fraction higher. You are not an innovator. You are a parasite. That, at last, produced the slightest shift in Vale's presence, not a loss of control, but a tightening, like a string drawn more tautly across an instrument. You speak from the old fear, he replied, the worship of the isolated self, the belief that a mind belongs to itself simply because it happens to reside within one skull at a time. Elias spoke before Williamson could answer, not because he wished to defend the argument, but because he wanted Vale speaking, wanted him confident, revealing, and perhaps proud enough to continue. If this lattice is only the first iteration, he said, keeping his voice even, then what was the next step? Vale turned toward him fully then, and though the face remained blurred at the edges, Elias felt the entire attention of that preserved intelligence settle on him with startling intensity. Scale, Vale said. Refinement, stability. The anchor points used thus far were merely temporary conductors, chosen for accessibility rather than suitability. Ordinary minds fracture when linked too directly. They lose sequence, continuity, and often dignity. But with proper calibration, and with a sufficiently prepared central channel, the problem can be resolved. Prepared central channel, Elias repeated, though inwardly he already feared the answer. A living mind, Vale said, and the words were so calmly offered that for one cold instant they seemed not cruel, but academic, as though he were discussing the construction of a bridge rather than the violation of a person. Alert, disciplined, resistant enough to survive structured contact and subtle enough to maintain directional integrity. A custodian within the network, rather than a decaying remnant such as myself. The implication landed with perfect force. Elias felt Williamson understand it at the same instant. You brought us here on purpose, Elias said. Vale did not deny it. I allowed the pattern to be discovered. There is a difference. Williamson's eyes narrowed. You manipulated the investigation. Manipulated is such an emotional word. I arranged probabilities. The frightened woman was found. The careful shopkeeper heard what he needed to half remember. The marks were concealed well enough to escape routine notice, yet not so well that an observant Auror could not detect them. All systems produce their own answer when pressured correctly. I merely trusted the Auror office to send me the sort of mind it would value most. A silence fell then, but it was a dangerous silence, sharp at the edges, and Elias felt a pulse of anger move through him with such clarity that he had to master it deliberately, because Vale had not merely harmed Clara Vane and Bernard Pike and the others whose names sat in the ministry file. He had used them as bait. Their fear, their confusion, their missing memories had been laid out like stepping stones leading inward toward this hall, toward this final confrontation, and toward him. "You wanted an Auror," Elias said. "I wanted the right one," Vale replied. "Not the loudest, not the most brutal, not one of those post-war peacocks who mistake suspicion for intelligence. I required someone capable of perceiving structure before panic, someone who could feel a pattern and continue toward it rather than turning away. Someone patient enough to notice what is withheld." The words struck him with the force of a trap springing shut, because they explained too much at once, not only the sequence of clues, but the strange sensation he had felt from the beginning that the case was drawing him, rather than merely being solved by him. Vale had chosen the shape of the path, had designed the discovery, had relied upon the ministry's own standards to deliver him the precise kind of mind he sought. Williamson took one hard step forward. "You will not touch him." Vale's form rippled once more, and this time the response held something almost like regret. "You think too narrowly. I have already touched him." The moment he entered the lattice, the system recognized compatibility. Elias's breath went still. He did not look at Williamson, because he did not need to. He could feel the older Auror's readiness beside him like a drawn blade, but he also knew, with a clarity so cold that it bordered on terror, that Vale was telling the truth in part, because since crossing the ruined boundary wall, he had felt the structure responding to him, not simply noticing his presence, but aligning around it. The half-heard phrase at the threshold, the peculiar ease with which the pressure in the house had resolved into meaning, even the terrible impression that some part of the lattice had awaited not merely an intruder, but a specific kind of consciousness. None of it was coincidence. "Crow," Williamson said quietly, without taking his gaze off Vale. "Tell me what you are feeling." It was not a question born of doubt, but of discipline. Elias answered in the same spirit. Pressure, but organized. Thought without language at first. Recognition. Since entering the hall, more coherence. He hesitated only a moment before forcing himself to say the rest. And something like invitation. Vale smiled then, or perhaps only allowed the idea of a smile to pass across that unfinished face. "You see? It is already beginning to harmonize." Williamson's answer came in the form of action. With a movement so swift that it seemed to cut the air itself, he cast a severing curse toward the nearest line of the lattice, not at Vale's projected form, but at the converging geometry upon the floor, aiming to shatter the construct at its most obvious point of vulnerability. The curse struck the stone with a blinding flash and a crack like split iron, yet instead of breaking the pattern, the force ran along it, traveled outward through the dark lines in a violent arc, and vanished upward into the rafters with a roar that shook dust from the ceiling and sent fragments of old plaster raining down. The lattice had absorbed the strike. Vale did not even turn his head. "Do not be disappointed. You are attacking the visible portion of a distributed system. 5 anchors, 1 convergence, multiple redundancies. Had it been so easy to destroy, I would not have survived this long." Williamson cast again, this time a layered disruption charm designed to unravel magical continuity rather than bludgeon it, but the result was scarcely better. The hall shuddered, the black lines flared with a deep violet light. and somewhere in the unseen rooms beyond the entrance chamber, a door slammed of its own accord with enough force to make the walls answer. Yet the pattern remained intact. And then Elias felt it. Not physically, not as pain, but as a deep inward tug, sudden and intimate, like a hand reaching into the root of his thoughts and turning them slightly out of true. Images flashed across his mind so quickly they scarcely had form. The corridor of the Auror office beneath its lamplight, Clara Vane standing confused in her kitchen, Bernard Pike in the rain with his wand raised toward a brick wall, and beneath it all, a sensation of lines connecting place to place, mind to mind, memory to memory, until sequence itself threatened to dissolve into a single shared pulse. He staggered half a step and caught himself. Williamson turned at once. "Crow." "I'm all right," Elias said, though the words emerged through clenched control rather than certainty. Vale watched with terrible attentiveness. "No, you are not all right. You are experiencing the first strain of structural contact without preparation. Another minute of unmanaged exposure, and the lattice will begin sorting your memories for points of compatibility." "Oh," Williamson moved closer to Elias without lowering his wand. "Can you hold your shield?" "Yes." "Can you withdraw?" Elias opened his mouth to answer and found, with a sudden flare of dread, that the question was harder than it should have been, because while his body remained his own, some subtler faculty in him had already begun to calculate the room, not as a man seeking escape would calculate it, but as the lattice itself might, as geometry, as flow, as connection. The center of the hall no longer seemed merely a dangerous place. It seemed meaningful, necessary. He could still resist that perception, but the fact that he had to resist at all was answer enough. Vale saw it, too. "He cannot retreat cleanly now," he said almost gently. "The system has him by the edges." Williamson's face became stone. "Then it will take both of us." He reached into his robes with his free hand and withdrew a small silver flask Elias had not seen before, etched with old ministry wards and sealed with red wax. Williamson broke the seal with his thumb and thrust it toward him. "Drink." "What is it?" "Occlusive draft, experimental, temporary cognitive isolation." His voice hardened. "Now." Elias obeyed at once. The liquid was bitter enough to sting his throat, cold as if drawn from deep underground, and within seconds a strange heaviness settled around his thoughts, not dulling them, but enclosing them, like shutters being drawn across windows from the inside. The pressure of the lattice did not vanish, yet it lost its intimate angle of entry. What had felt like fingers in his mind became instead a force beating against locked doors. Vale's presence sharpened instantly. "Clever," he said. "Crude, but clever." "You have delayed contact." "Enough to finish this," Williamson replied. For the first time since they had entered Blackthorn Hall, Elias saw something like calculation turn urgent in Vale's expression. Not fear, exactly, because the preserved man was too altered for that simple human reaction, but an adjustment, the recognition that conditions were changing beyond his preferred design. The lattice lines brightened at once beneath him, and the dark center of the pattern began to thrum with a low, resonant vibration that Elias felt in his ribs more than heard with his ears. "He is accelerating it," Elias said. "Yes," Williamson answered, "which means he still needs the process complete." That was the key. Not invulnerable, then. Not finished. However stable the structure appeared, Vale still required something from him, from a living central channel, and the moment the occlusive draft had blocked easy access, the preserved wizard had begun forcing the sequence ahead. That urgency was weakness. All magic under pressure revealed its seams. Elias drew a slow breath, letting the bitter cold of the potion steady his mind, and looked not at Vale's form, nor even at the lines underfoot, but beyond them, into the hall itself, at the walls, the ceiling, the old stone that held the chamber together. 5 anchors, 1 convergence, a distributed system built through existing structures, and at the center, not simply power, but dependence. "Williamson," he said, the plan arriving complete as he spoke it, "the lattice is not resting on the floor." The older Auror understood at once. "It's in the house," he said. Elias nodded. "The hall is the vessel. We've been striking the pattern when we need to break the chamber that sustains it." Vale moved then, not stepping, for he had no true feet upon the ground, but expanding, his form flaring outward in a burst of darkened light, as though to occupy more of the room at once. The pressure in Elias's mind slammed against the occlusive draft with renewed force, and Williamson raised a shield that rang like struck glass as unseen magic crashed against it from all sides. "Then move!" Williamson barked. And with that, the stillness ended at last, because Auror and preserved sorcerer, hunter and architect, victim chosen by circumstance and veteran determined not to lose him, had passed beyond revelation into open struggle, and the house that had waited so long in silence was finally forced to declare which of its loyalties would break first. The moment Elias Crow and Senior Auror Williamson abandoned the central lattice and turned their focus toward the structure of Blackthorn Hall itself, the nature of the conflict shifted from contained confrontation into something far more volatile. Because what had once been a silent ruin now revealed itself as an active participant in the struggle. Its walls no longer passive stone, but conduits through which Septimus Vale's will could move with disturbing fluidity, responding not merely to intrusion, but to intention itself. They did not retreat in panic, for both understood that distance alone would not free them from the lattice's influence, but instead moved with deliberate speed along the inner perimeter of the hall, their wands raised, their attention divided between the immediate threats forming around them and the deeper objective that Elias had identified, namely the destabilization of the house as a unified magical vessel. Because if the lattice depended upon the integrity of the structure, then to fracture that integrity, even partially, might be enough to break the coherence of the entire system. The first manifestation came without warning, from the far wall, where cracked plaster clung in thin, curling sheets. A series of dark lines erupted outward, not breaking the stone, but emerging from it like veins forced suddenly to the surface, branching rapidly across the wall and then along the ceiling, forming a network that mirrored the lattice beneath their feet, but extended in 3 dimensions, transforming the hall into a cage of intersecting currents through which energy pulsed with increasing intensity. "Do not let them connect fully," Elias said, his voice controlled despite the rising pressure in his mind, because even through the occlusive draft he could feel the lattice straining toward him, searching for entry points, adapting to the resistance it encountered. Williamson responded without hesitation, casting a wide dispersal charm that struck the nearest cluster of lines and shattered them into flickering fragments. Yet even as they broke apart, new strands formed in their place, not identical but adjusted, as though the system were learning from each disruption, refining its configuration in real time. "He is adapting," Williamson said, not with surprise, but with confirmation. "Yes," Elias replied, his thoughts racing as he mapped the behavior of the magic against the structure around them. "This is not static. It is iterative. The house is not just holding the lattice, it is recalculating it." Vale's voice returned then, no longer calm, no longer distant, but threaded through the very walls, echoing from multiple directions at once so that its origin could not be fixed. "You are forcing inefficiency," it said, and though the tone remained measured, there was now an unmistakable urgency beneath it. "The system must compensate. That increases instability. That increases risk." "Good," Williamson answered sharply, sending another targeted disruption into a junction point where several lines converged. "Let it break." "You do not understand what you are breaking," Vale replied, and for the first time there was something like strain in the voice. Not fear, but resistance meeting opposition. Elias moved quickly along the edge of the hall, his gaze sweeping across the walls, the ceiling, the floor, searching not for the most visible points of activity, but for the subtle irregularities that would reveal where the lattice drew its strength. Because if Vale had constructed this system with precision, then there would be nodes, critical points where the flow of magic converged before dispersing again, and those nodes would not necessarily be where the energy appeared strongest, but where it appeared most stable. "There," he said suddenly, pointing toward a section of wall partially obscured by a collapsed beam. Williamson followed his line of sight and saw it at once, a region where the lines did not flicker or branch, but held steady, forming a compact and tightly bound cluster that pulsed with a deeper, slower rhythm than the rest of the network. "A stabilizer," Williamson said. "Yes," Elias replied. "Break it, and the system loses coherence." They moved together, closing the distance with swift and controlled steps, yet before they could reach the point, the house itself reacted. The floor beneath them shifted, not in a crude or violent manner, but with a subtle realignment that altered their footing just enough to disrupt balance, as though the very geometry of the room had been adjusted to delay them. And at the same time, the pressure in Elias's mind surged, pushing against the occlusive barrier with renewed force, probing for weakness, searching for any fracture through which it might enter. "You are resisting," Vale's voice said, now closer, more focused. "That is inefficient. Cooperation would reduce strain. It would preserve your cognitive integrity." Elias did not answer, because he could feel the truth hidden within the manipulation, the way the words were structured not merely to communicate, but to influence, to reshape thought patterns subtly enough that resistance might begin to feel like error, and instead he focused entirely on the stabilizer node ahead, narrowing his awareness to a single objective. They reached it together. Williamson struck first, a concentrated severing curse aimed not at the surface lines, but at the point where they intersected beneath the stone, and for a fraction of a second nothing happened, as though the magic had absorbed the impact without consequence. Then the wall cracked. Not outward, not explosively, but inward, as though something within the stone had been pulled apart, and with that fracture, the lines surrounding it faltered, their steady pulse breaking into uneven flickers that spread outward in a widening ripple. The effect was immediate. Across the hall, the network destabilized, sections of it collapsing into disorganized strands that no longer aligned, and the central lattice on the floor responded in kind, its dark lines losing their perfect geometry, bending slightly, warping under the strain. Vale reacted at once. His form surged, expanding outward in a wave of darkened light that filled the hall, and the pressure in Elias's mind struck with such force that even the occlusive draft faltered, allowing fragments of foreign thought to slip through. Images not his own, patterns not fully formed, a sense of connection so vast and intricate that it threatened to dissolve the boundaries of individual identity. "You are damaging the system," Vale said. And now there was no calm, no detachment, only controlled urgency. That will not end it. It will only make it unstable. That is the point, Williamson replied, already preparing another strike. Elias staggered slightly, catching himself against the edge of the broken wall, his vision narrowing for a moment as the competing forces within his mind strained against each other, because the lattice was no longer merely pressing against him. It was reacting to him, adjusting its structure in response to his resistance, attempting to integrate him even as it was being torn apart. "Another node," he forced out, his voice tight but steady. "We need to hit at least 2 more to collapse the system." Williamson did not hesitate. "Find it." Elias pushed himself upright, forcing his focus outward despite the growing intrusion within, and scanned the hall once more, this time with heightened urgency, because the lattice was adapting faster now, reconfiguring its pathways, compensating for the loss of the first stabilizer. And he knew that if they did not act quickly, the system would regain coherence, perhaps even strengthen itself against further disruption. "There," he said again, indicating a point near the base of the staircase that curved upward into darkness. They moved. The house resisted. The air thickened, the floor shifted again, and the lines of the network surged toward them, attempting to block their path not with physical force, but with distortion, bending perception, altering distance so that each step required greater effort than it should have, as though they were walking not through space, but through resistance itself. Vale's voice pressed against Elias's mind once more, no longer attempting persuasion, but exerting pressure. "You cannot win this," it said. "The structure is already active. The connections are already formed. Even if you break it here, the principle remains. It will be rebuilt." "Not tonight," Elias replied, and though the words were spoken aloud, they carried the full weight of his intent. They reached the second node. This time Elias struck first, channeling everything he had left into a focused disruption that targeted not the visible lines, but the underlying coherence that held them together. And as the spell connected, the effect was more violent than before. The staircase shuddered. The wall split with a sharp, echoing crack, and the network across the hall collapsed in a cascade of broken light. Vale's form flickered. For the first time since they had entered Blackthorn Hall, the figure at the center of the lattice lost its stability, its edges breaking apart into fragments that struggled to maintain cohesion, and the pressure in Elias's mind surged one final time before faltering, as though the system itself had lost the ability to sustain its hold. "Now," Williamson said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The center." Elias turned toward the lattice. It was no longer perfect. The dark lines had warped, the central point no longer held its absolute stillness, and the entire structure seemed to tremble under the strain of its own instability, as though it were on the verge of collapse. But not yet broken. Not yet ended. And Elias knew with absolute certainty that whatever remained of Septimus Vale was bound to that center, and that if they did not finish it now, the opportunity would be lost. He stepped forward, into the lattice. And as the final phase of the conflict began, he understood that this was no longer a matter of investigation or containment, but of survival, not only for himself, but for every mind that had already been touched by the design. Because if the structure held, even in broken form, it would not simply wait. It would spread. When Elias Crow stepped into the fractured lattice, the world did not shatter, nor did it explode into chaos as one might have expected from a structure so violently destabilized, but instead it tightened, drew inward, and reassembled itself around him in a manner so precise and so immediate that it felt less like entering a spell and more like becoming part of a system that had been waiting for exactly this moment to complete itself. The air ceased to feel like air, and the stone beneath his boots lost its simple solidity, transforming instead into something layered, something that held not only physical presence but intention, as though every surface within Blackthorn Hall had been reduced to a set of instructions waiting to be executed. And as Elias took a second step forward, he felt those instructions begin to align around him, testing, probing, mapping the structure of his thoughts with a quiet and relentless efficiency. Behind him, Williamson shouted something, though the words reached him only as distant echoes, stretched thin across a space that no longer behaved according to ordinary distance. And Elias understood at once that he had crossed a threshold not marked by visible lines, but by function, because while his body remained within the hall, his mind had been drawn into the core of the lattice itself, into the very mechanism that Septimus Vale had constructed to bridge thought and form. The presence of Vale surged around him. Not as a figure now, not as something separate, but as an environment, a pervasive awareness that filled the space with a cold and ordered intelligence. And when the voice came again, it was no longer external. No longer something that entered his thoughts from without, but something that emerged from within the same structure that now held him. "You see now," Vale said, and the words unfolded not as sound, but as understanding. "This is not coercion, this is integration." Elias did not answer at once, because he could feel the lattice attempting to reshape the way he formed responses, smoothing out resistance, aligning his thoughts into patterns that would fit more easily within its design. And instead of speaking, he focused on holding the boundaries of his own mind intact, reinforcing them with the same discipline that had carried him through the earlier stages of the confrontation. "This is theft," he said at last, forcing the words into clarity, anchoring them in his own will. "You are taking what does not belong to you." "Belonging is an inefficient concept," Vale replied. "Knowledge, perception, awareness, these are not possessions. They are functions. They exist to be used." The lattice shifted. Around Elias, the space began to resolve into something more structured, not the physical hall, but a representation of the network itself. Lines of dark energy stretching outward in every direction, connecting points he recognized from his investigation. Clara Vane's cottage, Bernard Pike's shop, the remaining locations he had not yet visited, all linked through a geometry that pulsed with a steady, measured rhythm. And at the center of it all, he felt Vale. Not as a body, but as a node, a consciousness distributed across the system, anchored at the convergence point, yet extending outward through every line, every connection, every fragment of the lattice that remained intact. "You built this to replace yourself," Elias said, the realization forming with sudden clarity. "You knew you would not survive in your original form, so you created something that could persist without it." "Survival is not the objective," Vale replied. "Continuity is." Elias felt the pressure increase. The lattice was no longer merely observing him, but interacting, drawing upon his memories, his experiences, testing them against its structure, seeking compatibility, and for a moment, he saw fragments of his own past reflected back at him, his training in the Auror office, the long hours spent studying defensive magic, the quiet discipline that had defined his approach to every case, all of it laid out as data, as components to be evaluated and potentially integrated. "You are suitable," Vale said. "Your mind is stable, adaptable, resistant without being rigid. You can serve as the central channel." Elias felt the words settle into him, not as suggestion, but as pressure, as a force attempting to shape his response before he could fully form it himself. And for a fraction of a second, the idea of it made a terrible kind of sense. Because within the lattice, individuality did not feel like strength, but like limitation, a fragmentation that could be resolved into something larger, something more efficient, more complete. Then he remembered Clara Vane standing in her kitchen, her confusion, her fear, the missing piece of her memory that she could not recover, and the clarity returned with sudden and absolute force. "No," he said. The word did not echo. It struck. The lattice reacted instantly, the lines around him tightening, the connections flaring with increased intensity, as though the system itself had rejected the answer and moved to correct it. And Elias felt the first true intrusion into his mind, not subtle, not probing, but direct, an attempt to override resistance through sheer structural pressure. "You misunderstand," Vale said, and now there was urgency, not calm, not detachment, but something closer to insistence. "This is not loss, this is expansion. You will not cease to exist, you will become more." Elias held his ground. "More of what?" he demanded. "More of you." The lattice faltered, not in function but in coherence, as though the question itself had introduced a contradiction into the system. And for the first time, Elias felt something shift within Vale's presence. Not doubt, not uncertainty, but the smallest fracture in the perfect logic that had defined him. "I am the system," Vale said, though the words lacked their earlier certainty. "The system is not me. It is greater." "Then why does it need you?" Elias replied, pressing the point, forcing the inconsistency into the open. "Why build it around your own consciousness if it is supposed to be more than you?" The pressure intensified again, but this time it carried strain. "Because it must begin somewhere," Vale answered. "Because structure requires origin." "Then it is not independent," Elias said. "It is an extension, a reflection, and if it grows, it does not become something new. It becomes more of you." The lattice trembled. Not physically, not in the way stone cracks or metal bends, but in its logic, in the alignment of its purpose, because Elias had identified the flaw at its core, the contradiction that Vale had either ignored or justified, that a system built to eliminate individuality had been constructed entirely around a single dominant consciousness, and that as long as that remained true, it could never become what Vale claimed it to be. "You are imposing a false dichotomy," Vale said, though now the words came faster, less measured. "The system will evolve beyond its origin." "But it hasn't yet," Elias replied, "and until it does, everything you take becomes part of you, not part of something greater." For a moment, there was silence. Then the lattice surged. Not outward, not expanding, but inward, collapsing toward the center with a force that Elias felt in every layer of his mind, as though Vale had abandoned the attempt at persuasion and moved instead to force the integration through sheer structural dominance. "If you will not accept the transition," Vale said, and now there was no calm left, only controlled intensity, "then you will be incorporated regardless." The lines closed around Elias. The connections tightened. And for the first time since entering the lattice, he felt the full weight of its design pressing against him, not as an abstract force, but as a system attempting to rewrite him from within, to take the structure of his thoughts and align it with its own, piece by piece, memory by memory, until resistance itself became impossible. But Elias Crow did not break. Because even as the pressure mounted, even as the boundaries of his mind strained against the force applied to them, he held on to the one truth that the lattice could not absorb, could not reshape, could not redefine without destroying itself. He was not a component. He was a choice. And as the system closed in, he prepared to make it. In the crushing heart of the lattice, where thought and spellwork had ceased to be separate things, and where the preserved will of Septimus Vale pressed upon him with all the intimate violence of a hand seeking to close around the roots of another mind, Elias Crow discovered that resistance, if it were to endure, could not remain merely defensive, because defense alone would eventually be worn down by repetition, by pressure, by the cold persistence of a structure designed to test every weakness until weakness ceased to be accidental and became instead the shape of surrender. The lines around him tightened further, dark currents of linked intention crossing through one another with such precision that they no longer resembled magic in the ordinary sense, but rather the inner workings of some enormous invisible instrument, each strand responding to his thoughts almost before he fully formed them, each resistance answered by a fresh adjustment. As though the entire construct had been built not simply to impose force, but to learn from opposition and refine its methods accordingly. He could feel it mapping him, cataloging the rhythm of his memory, the sequence of his fears, the old habits of discipline that had made him useful to the Auror office, and had now, through a cruelty of circumstance, made him desirable to Vale as the central living channel for the network. "You cannot outlast structure," Vale said, and though the words still came through the medium of thought rather than sound, their edge had hardened into something almost personal. "You are one mind. I am continuity distributed through design. Every moment you resist, the system becomes more specifically able to contain you." Elias did not waste strength arguing that point, because in one sense, Vale was right. So long as he remained inside the terms of the lattice, answering pressure with resistance alone, he would eventually be forced into exhaustion, and exhaustion, within a construct of this kind, would be indistinguishable from consent. But he had not become an Auror by assuming that every problem must be solved according to the logic preferred by the adversary. He had learned, sometimes painfully, that the quickest way to lose a fight was to accept the enemy's description of what the fight actually was. And so, instead of bracing again against the inward force, Elias did something that for one terrifying instant felt almost like surrender. He let his mind move with the structure rather than against it, not yielding, not opening himself, but observing from within the motion itself, allowing the lattice to carry his awareness along its channels just far enough for him to see how the currents fed one another and where they narrowed before dispersing outward again. It was a dangerous strategy because proximity increased the risk of deeper integration, yet danger had already become the ground beneath his feet, and he needed more than endurance now. He needed weakness. He needed the flaw by which a system that believed itself inevitable might still be broken. At once the lattice responded to the altered quality of his resistance. The pressure changed. The currents around him softened at the edges, not from kindness, but from calculation, as though Vale believed the first stages of acceptance had begun. Elias felt new pathways open, more of the design revealing itself to his perception, and within that revelation lay exactly what he had hoped to find. Because for all its complexity, the network did not distribute authority evenly. It claimed to be more than Vale, claimed to be an emerging collective structure beyond any single origin. Yet every channel of consequence curved inward at critical moments toward one governing point. Not merely the center, but a preference, a bias. An old human habit hidden inside inhuman architecture. Vale. The preserved consciousness was not merely resident within the system. It was constantly correcting it, continually interpreting, choosing, stabilizing, translating raw connection into usable coherence. Without that intervention, the lattice might still exist for a time, but as a damaged circuit rather than an ascending intelligence. That was the contradiction Elias had already touched with words, and now, within the mechanism itself, he felt its full weight. Vale had built a network to transcend individuality, yet he had trusted no mind but his own to hold it together. He had created not liberation from singular will, but the widest possible extension of it. "You are beginning to understand," Vale said, misreading the shift in Elias's awareness as progress toward compliance. "The burden of separateness is heavier than you knew. The system can relieve it." "No," Elias answered, and this time the word carried not strain but clarity. "I am beginning to understand you." The currents hesitated almost imperceptibly. "You confuse the vessel with the pattern," Vale replied quickly. "Do I?" Elias said. And now he moved with greater intention through the channels revealed to him, following one stream of connection outward to Clara Vane, another to Bernard Pike, another to the 3 other unwilling anchors whose names sat in the ministry reports like quiet accusations. In each case, he sensed not full occupancy, not ongoing domination, but impressions left behind, grooves cut into memory, doors forced and imperfectly closed. Vale had used them and withdrawn. He had not integrated them because they were unsuitable. Temporary conductors, disposable steps. "You call this a network, but every path bends toward your correction. Every line waits for your decision. Every mind you touch is filtered through your preferences before it becomes part of anything. The initial architecture requires governance. By you. By the most stable intelligence available. By you," Elias repeated, and now, instead of opposing the pressure around him, he drove the truth into the structure itself, not as rhetoric, but as identified inconsistency, because magic of this kind depended not only on energy, but on the conceptual integrity of its own design. If the lattice was built to function as a coherent system, then contradiction at its center was not mere philosophy. It was stress. You did not build equality. You built obedience with better language. For the first time, the response was not immediate. The channels around him shivered, and somewhere beyond the mental core of the lattice, he felt an answering rupture in the physical hall, as though Williamson, still fighting in the outer chamber, had struck another wound into the house. The system compensating outward and the contradiction Elias pressing inward met one another in the center with mounting instability. Then Vale answered, and the reply came edged with something very close to fury. "Autonomy is a superstition dressed as virtue. The weak cling to it because it excuses fragmentation, and the powerful praise it because it allows them to rule in pieces rather than wholes." The words arrived with force enough to rattle the channels, and in them Elias heard at last the human core that still lived inside all the talk of structure and continuity. Contempt. Not enlightened transcendence, not impartial progress, but the old and familiar conviction that other minds were material, useful only insofar as they might be arranged by a superior will. The lattice was magnificent in its complexity, terrible in its reach, yet at its heart sat an arrogance as ordinary as any dark wizard's dream of mastering others for their own good. Outside, faint but unmistakable, came Williamson's voice, raw with effort and distance. "Crow!" The sound reached him through the system as if from the far end of a tunnel, but it mattered less for its content than for what it proved. Williamson was still there. The house was still breaking. The battle existed in both places at once, within the mind and within the ruin, and the two fronts were connected. Elias did not need to overpower Vale in purely mental contest if he could instead force the preserved wizard to spend more of the lattice, stabilizing its own crumbling contradiction. He drew a breath that felt more like memory than air, and made his choice. Rather than trying to shield his mind further, he opened one carefully selected chamber of it. Not his fear, not his loyalty, not the disciplined structures Vale had admired and hoped to exploit, but memory itself, one specific sequence held bright and unyielding. Clara Vane at the back wall of her garden, bewildered and ashamed of confusion she had not caused. Bernard Pike standing in the rain behind his shop, trying to recall instructions that were never his to obey. Not abstractions, not case notes, but living people reduced to instruments. Elias released those memories into the channels not as offerings, but as evidence, letting the lattice feel what its temporary conductors had experienced. Not merely the gaps, but the violation, the helplessness, the indignity of being turned into extensions of a design they had never chosen. At once the system recoiled, not morally, for magic has no conscience of its own, but structurally, because those memories did not fit the elegant language Vale used to justify his work. They were the untidy truth beneath his terms, the human cost rendered in full emotional sequence, rather than reduced to efficient categories. The lattice could carry them, yes, but in carrying them, it also carried dissonance. The 5 anchor points were no longer abstract nodes in a geometric figure. They became, within the system, what they had always been: injuries. Vale struck back with brutal force. Elias felt the preserved consciousness attempt to smother the memories, to recast them as necessary discomfort, to seal them behind corrective logic. Yet that effort required attention, and attention drawn, there was attention not spent elsewhere. Cracks widened through the channels. The central convergence trembled. "You sentimental fool," Vale hissed, abandoning poise entirely. History is made by those willing to bear discomfort. "These are not your minds to spend," Elias answered. And now he drove not only Clara and Bernard into the structure, but the whole pattern of the case, the phrase complete the 5th, the manipulated clues, the engineered discovery, the baited investigation that had led him here. He forced the lattice to confront the truth of its own operation. It had not chosen the worthy. It had preyed upon the unwarned. It had not elevated minds. It had hunted them. You did not build this because the world was ready for it. You built it in secret because you knew no one would willingly give you what you wanted. The contradiction became shock. The central channels buckled, and in the same instant the physical world slammed back into him with violent, partial clarity. He was aware again of stone beneath his boots, of the ruined hall shaking around him, of light flashing at the edges of vision where spells struck walls and old enchantments screamed in answer. Vale's projected form, once composed and almost regal above the lattice, now flickered erratically, features tearing and reforming as though the system could not decide from moment to moment what shape he still possessed. Williamson stood near the far side of the hall, amid dust and broken masonry, one sleeve burned through and blood running from a cut above his brow, yet still upright, still casting, and at the base of the staircase behind him, a third stabilizing cluster had split open, leaving a jagged seam of violet light pulsing through the wall like an exposed nerve. "Now, Crow!" Williamson roared. Elias knew there would not be a better moment, perhaps not even another one. The lattice was destabilized from without by structural damage, and from within by contradiction. Vale, forced to spend his coherence suppressing the evidence of his own brutality, had lost the perfect balance on which the system depended. All that remained was to turn that imbalance fatal. He raised his wand, though it felt impossibly heavy, and did not aim at Veil's flickering form, nor at the lines beneath his feet, but straight into the dark central point where all the channels met, and where the preserved consciousness anchored itself to the house. There was no textbook spell for what he intended, no elegant charm laid down in ministry training manuals. He gathered instead every remaining thread of his will, every memory of the people Veil had used, every refusal that still made him himself, and drove it through the wand in a single act of concentrated severance, not meant to destroy magic itself, but to cut the right of one mind to govern all the others it had stolen. The spell leapt white. For an instant, the entire hall vanished inside light. The lattice answered with a scream that was not sound alone, but the rending of a structure losing faith in its own center, and Veil's form convulsed, stretched thin across a dozen impossible angles, as though the system could no longer agree where he ended, and it began. Then the first real collapse began. The light that erupted from Elias Crow's wand did not behave like ordinary spell work, because it did not travel in a clean line nor expand in a simple burst, but instead spread through the lattice in a manner disturbingly similar to the way the lattice itself had spread through minds and places, seeking not surfaces, but connections, threading its way along every channel Veil had constructed, until the entire system was filled with a brilliance that did not illuminate so much as expose, revealing every flaw, every forced alignment, every contradiction that had been carefully concealed beneath the language of structure and inevitability. For a single suspended instant, Blackthorn Hall ceased to be a ruin and became instead a diagram made visible, its walls, floors, and broken ceilings stripped of illusion and shown as intersecting planes within a single, failing construct. And at the center of it all, where the convergence point struggled to maintain coherence, Veil's presence flared outward in a desperate attempt to contain the unraveling, his form elongating, fragmenting, reforming again and again, as though sheer persistence might hold together what logic had already begun to tear apart. "You cannot sever continuity," he said, and though the words still reached both air and mind, they no longer carried the cold authority they once had, but instead trembled under the strain of contradiction. "You can only disrupt it. You can only delay what must eventually become whole." Elias stood within the failing lattice, his arms still extended, his breath sharp and uneven, because the act he had just performed wasn't one that could be sustained for long, not in a structure that continued to resist even as it collapsed. And yet he did not withdraw, did not allow the force to dissipate, because he understood that this was not a moment to conserve strength, but a moment to commit it entirely. "You built this on a lie," he said, his voice carrying not through sound alone, but through the very channels Veil had intended to control, because now those channels no longer obeyed a single direction. "You said it was more than you, but everything in it depends on you. You said it would free minds, but it cannot exist without taking them first. You did not remove limitation. You made yourself the only one who does not have it." The lattice shuddered. The lines that had once flowed with perfect precision now wavered, some collapsing outright, others bending into unstable shapes that no longer aligned with the original design, and the central convergence point began to fracture, not outward into visible destruction, but inward, as though the very idea that held it together had begun to lose coherence. Veil lashed out. Not with calm correction, not with measured adaptation, but with force born of necessity, and the pressure that struck Elias's mind in that instant was unlike anything that had come before, because it no longer sought compatibility or integration, but domination, a final attempt to overwhelm resistance through sheer magnitude, to force the system into completion before its internal contradictions could fully tear it apart. "You mistake structure for weakness," Vale said, and now the voice burned with intensity. No longer controlled, no longer detached. All systems require origin. All systems require direction. Without it, they collapse into chaos. You offer nothing but fragmentation in its place. Elias staggered, the force nearly driving him to his knees, his vision narrowing as the boundaries of his mind strained under the impact. Yet even as the pressure mounted, he held to the one truth that the lattice could not reconcile. "I offer choice," he said, forcing the words through the storm of imposed thought. "Something your system cannot allow." Behind him, through the failing structure, he felt Williamson move. The older Auror had not remained idle, had not relied solely on Elias's confrontation within the lattice, but had continued to strike at the physical structure of the hall itself. And now, with the system destabilized from within, those strikes carried far greater effect, because where before the house had absorbed and redirected force, it now faltered, unable to maintain the same level of coherence. A section of the ceiling gave way with a thunderous crack. Stone fell, the walls split further along the seams already weakened by earlier strikes, and the network that had once extended through them began to collapse in segments, each failure sending ripples through the remaining structure, amplifying the instability. "You are destroying the vessel," Vale said. And for the first time, there was something unmistakable in the voice. Fear. "Then it should not have been built this way," Williamson answered, his voice cutting through the chaos as he advanced, each step deliberate despite the collapsing structure around him. Elias felt the shift at once. The lattice, already strained by contradiction and internal disruption, could no longer fully compensate for the damage to the physical space that supported it, and the convergence point at its center began to lose definition. The dark core no longer stable, no longer fixed, but fluctuating as though it could not decide where it truly existed. "This is the end of it," Elias said, not as a declaration, but as recognition. Vale's form flickered violently. "You think destruction is victory," he said, though the words came fractured, uneven. "You think breaking this will restore what was lost. It will not. The world remains fragmented, minds remain isolated, ignorance remains the rule." "Maybe," Elias replied, his strength fading but his resolve sharpening, "but at least it will be their choice." The lattice collapsed further. The lines that had once connected distant points snapped, one after another, not with explosive force, but with a quiet finality, as though each break severed not only a magical link, but a claim, a right that had never truly belonged to the system in the first place. The memories held within it began to release. Clara Vane, Bernard Pike, the others. Elias felt them not as full consciousness, not as presence, but as echoes returning to their proper places, the missing pieces sliding back into the minds from which they had been taken, incomplete still. Perhaps never entirely whole again, but no longer bound within the lattice. Vale screamed. This time it was not controlled, not measured, but raw, the sound of a mind losing its structure, of continuity breaking where it had once been absolute, and as the final connection snapped, his form collapsed inward, drawn toward the failing convergence point, as though the system itself could no longer support even the illusion of his existence. "You cannot stop this," he said, the words fragmenting as they formed. "The principle remains. Someone will understand. Someone will finish it." Elias did not answer. because the answer no longer mattered. The structure was breaking. The system was ending. And whatever came after would not be this. With a final, shuddering collapse, the central point imploded, not outward, but inward, folding in on itself until nothing remained but a fading trace of darkened stone. And in that moment, the presence of Septimus Vale vanished completely, leaving behind not a body, not a spirit, but an absence where something had once forced itself to remain. The lattice was gone. And with it, the conflict that had drawn Elias Crow into its center. But as the last fragments of the structure dissolved, and the ruined hall settled into true silence for the first time since they had entered, one truth remained. Quiet and unresolved. Vale had not been entirely wrong. The idea still existed. And ideas, once formed, did not die so easily. For several seconds after the collapse of the lattice, neither Elias Crow nor Senior Auror Williamson moved, because when a force that has filled every wall, every thought, and every breath of a place vanishes all at once, the silence it leaves behind can feel less like relief than shock. And Blackthorn Hall, stripped at last of the unnatural intelligence that had animated it, seemed to sag inward around them like a carcass from which the animating spirit had fled. Dust hung in the ruined entrance chamber in slow, drifting clouds, silvered by the unsteady light of their wands, and broken stones lay strewn across the floor where the seams of the house had finally given way under the strain of their struggle. Yet the most striking change was not the damage, nor the bitter smell of magic burned too hard and too long, but the absence of pressure, because for the first time since Elias had crossed the boundary wall outside, his mind belonged entirely to itself again, with no second intelligence brushing at its edges, no hidden current attempting to align his thoughts into patterns not his own. And that simple fact, so ordinary in any other hour of any other night, felt then like one of the greatest mercies he had ever known. Williamson lowered his wand first, though not by much, and looked across the shattered remains of the central convergence point, where only scorched stone and a dark, circular fracture now marked the place from which Vale's preserved consciousness had governed the lattice. "Can you stand?" he asked. The question was practical, unsentimental, and for that very reason more reassuring than comfort would have been. Elias drew a careful breath, became aware of the soreness in his knees and shoulders, of a lingering ache behind his eyes, and of the strange hollowness that follows intense magical strain, and then gave a slight nod. Yes. Williamson studied him a moment longer, as though judging whether the answer was accurate or merely dutiful, and then accepted it. Good. Because if this place means to fall down honestly now that it is no longer being held together by arrogance and stolen minds, I would prefer to be outdoors when it remembers gravity. That, from Williamson, counted almost as humor, and Elias found, to his own surprise, that the corner of his mouth twitched in answer before exhaustion reclaimed his face. They moved at once, not running, because haste in a collapsing ruin can kill as efficiently as hesitation, but with the measured speed of men who knew precisely how much danger still remained. The hall no longer resisted them, no longer shifted its geometry or thickened the air to impede their steps, and the difference was so profound that even the broken floor seemed gentler underfoot than the intact stones had felt when Vale's system still possessed them. As they crossed the threshold and emerged into the cold night air beyond the ruined doors of Blackthorn Hall, Elias stopped and turned, compelled by something he could not yet name, and looked back at the estate rising dark against the sky. Without the lattice, the house was only a house after all, a broken and abandoned shell left to ivy, rain, and legal neglect. and though its silhouette still carried the memory of menace, that menace no longer lived within it. Somewhere inside, old rafters groaned. A section of masonry gave way with a dull crash, and then the estate settled again into the stillness of genuine emptiness. Williamson stood beside him, one hand pressed briefly to the cut above his brow before lowering it again. "You heard what he said at the end." It was not phrased as a question. "Yes," Elias replied. The older Auror nodded once, looking not at Elias but toward the broken roofline of the hall. He was right in only one sense. Ideas are harder to bury than bodies, which is why we do not merely file this as a dark artifact incident and congratulate ourselves. Elias let the cold air steady him before answering. "There will be records." "There are always records," Williamson said. "Fragments in sealed departments, private notes in old houses, theories misfiled under names polite people stopped mentioning. The ministry is excellent at hiding what embarrasses it, and considerably less skilled at ensuring what it hides cannot be found again." They walked farther from the estate then, crossing the neglected grounds until they reached the broken boundary wall where the pressure had first changed on entering, and only there, beyond the remains of Vale's immediate design, did Williamson stop and turn fully toward him. "Tell me exactly what you remember from inside the lattice," he said. Elias did, because there was no value in withholding anything now. He described the sensation of entering the core, the way thought had become structure, the revelation that every channel still bent toward Vale's governing intelligence, the contradiction at the center of the system, and the method by which he had forced the lattice to feel the human cost of its own operation. He spoke, too, of the danger that had nearly taken him, the terrible seduction of efficiency that had accompanied the system's logic, and the moment in which choice itself had become the one thing the lattice could neither absorb nor redefine without breaking its own claims. Williamson listened in complete silence from beginning to end, interrupting only once to clarify a detail regarding the returning memory traces of the 5 unwilling anchor points. When Elias had finished, the older Auror drew a long breath and looked eastward, where the first suggestion of approaching dawn had begun to thin the blackness of the horizon. "We will recover the victims quietly," he said at last. "Not because the truth should be hidden from them, but because the wrong version of it in the wrong ears would create panic and opportunists in equal measure. Each one will be examined for lasting harm, and St. Mungo's mind healers will be read into the case under binding confidentiality. The site will be sealed. What remains of Vale's work will be collected, catalogued, and buried so deeply that any fool wishing to revive it will need to dig through half the government to do so. And if half the government helped hide it the first time," Elias said, more wearily than bitterly. Williamson's eyes shifted toward him. "Then we make certain the other half knows what it nearly cost." They returned to the ministry before sunrise by means of a secure transport chain rather than direct apparition, because Williamson insisted on multiple stabilizing checks for Elias after prolonged contact with the lattice, and though Elias would once have found the caution excessive, he had looked too closely into Vale's design to resent it now. The healers in the secure wing subjected him to a sequence of diagnostic spells, memory verification charms, and protective scans thorough enough to test the patience of a saint. Yet their findings, when at last they were complete, proved better than any of them had feared. There was strain, certainly, and magical exhaustion severe enough to require rest and a regimen of restorative drafts, but no sign of implanted directives, no residual foreign presence, and no lasting fracture in memory or identity. The occlusive draft Williamson had forced upon him in the hall, crude as Vale had called it, had almost certainly prevented the final stages of integration from taking hold. By noon, teams had been dispatched to the remaining incident sites. The hidden marks were found, the buried U fragments recovered, the wards around each location strengthened, and the 5 victims, Clara Vane and Bernard Pike among them, were brought under discreet ministry protection for examination and support. Their missing memories did not return in full because magic that wounds the mind rarely restores with the neatness of a reversed charm. But enough resurfaced for each of them to understand that the fear and confusion they had felt had not been madness, nor negligence, nor some private failure of character. Elias visited Clara 2 days later in a quiet recovery room at St. Mungo's, where sunlight lay across the coverlet of her bed and a pot of untouched tea sat cooling on the table by the window. And when he told her, as carefully and plainly as he could, that the force behind the missing time had been found and destroyed, he saw something loosen in her face that no healing spell could have accomplished. "So it really happened," she said, not as a question, but as a release from self-doubt. "Yes," Elias answered, "it really happened, and it is over." She closed her eyes then, not dramatically, not with tears, but with the exhausted relief of a person returning at last to a reality that made sense, even if it had been shaped by something terrible. "Good," she whispered. "I was beginning to think the missing piece was me." That sentence remained with him long after he left the ward, because it seemed to Elias that Vale's crime had lived most cruelly, not in the complexity of the lattice, nor in the stolen movements of unwilling hands, but in that quieter theft, namely the way he had made decent people doubt the soundness of their own minds. The ministry report would speak of distributed enchantments, cognitive intrusion, prohibited experimental magic, and the neutralization of an illegally preserved posthumous intelligence, because that was how institutions wrote when they wished to preserve order. Yet the truer version was simpler and more human than any official summary would allow. 5 innocent people had been used, frightened, and made to question themselves, and an Auror who had nearly become the 6th and most valuable victim had chosen, at the narrowest point of the night, not to become a conduit for another man's design. The official inquiry lasted 3 weeks. Unspeakables were drawn in, not happily, and the sealed records on Septimus Vale were at last opened under conditions that produced much embarrassment and very little dignity among certain senior officials who had once preferred silence. It emerged, as Williamson had expected, that Vale's work had never truly disappeared after the war, but had instead been dispersed through confidential memoranda, restricted archives, and polite administrative evasions so tiresome and so familiar that Elias found them almost more offensive than the dark magic itself. Yet this time, because the evidence came not from rumor but from a shattered estate, 5 living witnesses and 1 surviving Auror whose testimony the senior ranks could not easily dismiss, the matter could not be buried again in quite the same way. Protections were drafted. Certain research categories were reclassified under stricter oversight. A special review was opened into wartime and post-war disappearances from the Department of Mysteries archives. The machinery of the ministry, slow and self-protective though it remained, had been forced at least to turn in the right direction. As for Blackthorn Hall, it was dismantled in stages under the supervision of curse breakers and structural enchanters until nothing remained upon the site but an excavated scar of earth and a protective ring of standing wards. No public notice explained why the ruins had vanished. To most of the wizarding world, the estate had simply passed from legal nuisance into non-existence, which suited Elias well enough. Some victories, he thought, did not need an audience. Spring deepened over Britain. The hedges greened, rain softened the last hard soil of winter. Life, indifferent and persistent, resumed its ordinary habits with almost insulting calm. And in that return to ordinary days, Elias found the true ending of the case, not in the destruction of Vale's convergence point, but in the restoration of proportion. Memos returned to being memos. Wand reports became mostly dull again. People argued in the ministry canteen over broom regulations and budget allocations instead of cognitive lattices and preserved minds. Clara Vane resumed her tincture work. Bernard Pike reopened his shop and complained, according to one field note, that ministry boots had scuffed his stairwell. Even Williamson returned to his usual manner of dry impatience, which Elias privately counted as a sign that the world had not gone too far wrong after all. On an evening several weeks later, as golden light from the false ministry sky slanted across the Auror office and turned stacks of parchment to amber at the edges, Williamson stopped beside Elias's desk and placed a thin folder upon it. "Closed," he said. Elias looked at the file. There was no flourish on the cover, only a case number and a formal title. "Auror Crow," Williamson added, not moving away yet. "You were selected by circumstance, used as bait by a dead man's ambition, and very nearly made the keystone of something abominable. You are entitled to feel whatever you feel about that. But do not make the common mistake of believing victimhood and agency cannot inhabit the same hour. They can. And in your case, they did." For a moment, Elias said nothing, because Williamson was not a man given to speeches, and the rarity of the words gave them more weight than praise ever could have. At last he rested one hand on the closed folder and inclined his head. "Thank you, sir." Williamson gave the smallest shrug. "Do not thank me, file it properly." Then he moved on, and Elias, left once more at his desk beneath the drifting clouds of the enchanted ceiling, opened the folder and looked at the final notation declaring the matter resolved. He had begun the case as a young Auror handed a routine inquiry, had followed it through frightened homes and hidden marks, through a ruin shaped by stolen minds and the will of a man who believed all minds ought to belong to one design, and had come out the other side not unchanged, because no one steps into such a night and remains identical, but intact, which was a rarer fortune than most people understood. He closed the file, placed it in the outgoing tray, and for the first time since the case had begun, allowed himself to look up at the false sky above the ministry atrium without resentment. It was still artificial, still too orderly, still a painted promise rather than weather, yet now he found that he did not mind its pretense so much. Because outside those walls the real sky was waiting with all its uncertainty, and beneath it lived a world untidy enough to be free, fractured enough to require care, and human enough to remain worth defending. And so the case of the Auror, who had become, for a little while, a victim of circumstances, came at last to its proper end, not with mystery unresolved, nor with darkness lingering half-defeated in some hidden corridor, but with the pattern broken, the innocent released, the guilty undone, and one hard-won truth preserved where no lattice could ever reach it, namely that a mind is not a chamber to be occupied by the strongest will that can force its way inside, but a life to be guarded, however ordinary it may seem, because in that simple and stubborn freedom lies the whole meaning of what an Auror is meant to protect.
Ну що, друзі, це був професор Саламандр. Хотів донести думку. Знаєте, не сам загадковий задум Септімуса Вейла, а момент, коли Еліас Кроу не відмахнувся від дивної розповіді Клари Вейн про кілька втрачених хвилин пам'яті. Знаєте, ми часто недооцінюємо такі речі. Маленькі тривожні сигнали, незручні запитання, дивні відчуття, які здаються надто дрібними, щоб звертати на них увагу. Але саме завдяки уважності до цих дрібниць Еліас побачив те, чого не бачили інші. І здається, що це важливий урок не лише для чарівників. У житті великі проблеми рідко з'являються раптово. Найчастіше вони починаються з чогось маленького, з розмови, яку ми не захотіли продовжувати, з сумніву, який проігнорували, або з людини, яка намагалася сказати нам, що їй потрібна допомога. Дивіться, ми звикли цінувати гучні вчинки та великі перемоги, але часто саме уважність до дрібниць захищають нас від найбільших помилок. Тому іноді варто зупинитися і придивитися до того, що часто здається якимось там незвичним. Бо дуже часто правда ховається не в тому, що кричить, а в тому, що ледь чутно шепоче. З вами був ваш Саламандр, ваш звичайний Магл. До наступних історій.